Hey guys, tonight we begin with a group of religious radicals so insufferable that even the Dutch, famous for their tolerance, were relieved to see them leave. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1608, and a small congregation of English separatists has just arrived in Amsterdam after fleeing their homeland. They're exhausted, broke, and wanted by the authorities back in England. Their crime? Refusing to attend the official Church of England services. In the early 1600s, this wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was treason. King James I had made it abundantly clear: conform or suffer the consequences. These people chose consequences. But here's the thing about religious persecution that nobody tells you. It's rarely as simple as good guys versus bad guys. The Pilgrims, though they wouldn't be called that for another 2 centuries, weren't harmless, peaceful protesters. They were hardcore fundamentalists who believed the Church of England was so corrupt, so tainted by Catholic rituals and hierarchy, that it couldn't be reformed. It had to be abandoned entirely. They called themselves Separatists because they'd separated from the established church. Everyone else called them troublemakers. The Church of England, to be fair, was a hot mess. Created by Henry VIII because the Pope wouldn't let him divorce his way through 6 wives, it was a political institution masquerading as a spiritual one. By the time James I took the throne in 1603, the church was trying to be Catholic enough for traditionalists and Protestant enough for reformers, which meant it satisfied absolutely nobody. It was the theological equivalent of a committee-designed horse that turned into a camel. The Separatists looked at this camel and said, "No thanks, we'll walk." They wanted a pure church, a simple church, a church that followed the Bible literally and rejected anything that smelled like Catholic pageantry. No bishops, no fancy robes, no set prayers, no hierarchy. Just believers gathering to worship God directly, interpreting scripture themselves, choosing their own ministers. Revolutionary stuff. Also, illegal. King James took this personally. In his worldview, the monarch was God's appointed representative on earth, and the church was an extension of a royal authority. Rejecting the church meant rejecting the king, which meant rejecting God's order. These weren't just religious dissidents. They were seditious rebels who threatened the entire structure of English society. James had a gift for hyperbole and a talent for petty vendettas, and he promised to harry them out of the land. He meant it. The Separatists faced fines, imprisonment, and surveillance. Their meetings were raided, their leaders were arrested, their property was confiscated, and here's where it gets complicated, because some of this persecution was earned. These weren't mild-mannered Quakers sitting quietly in circles. The Separatists were loud, judgmental, and completely convinced they were right, and everyone else was damned. They called the Church of England a false church. They refused to attend services which was legally required. They held illegal gatherings. They published inflammatory pamphlets. They weren't asking for tolerance. They were demanding everyone else see the light or burn in hell. In other words, they were that guy at the party who won't shut up about CrossFit, except replace CrossFit with predestination and eternal damnation. One congregation, based in the village of Scrooby in Nottinghamshire, decided enough was enough. Led by their pastor John Robinson, and organised by William Brewster, a former postmaster who'd turned his manor house into an illegal church, they hatched a plan. They would leave England entirely. They would go to Holland, where the Dutch Reformed Church tolerated religious minorities. The Netherlands was fighting for independence from Catholic Spain, and religious freedom was part of their identity. Surely the Dutch would welcome fellow Protestant refugees. There was just one problem. Leaving England without permission was also illegal. In the autumn of 1607, the Scrooby congregation pooled their money and hired a ship captain to smuggle them across the North Sea. They travelled in small groups to the port of Boston in Lincolnshire, carrying whatever they could fit in sacks and carts. Children, elderly, sick, everyone came. They met the ship at night, crept aboard in the darkness, and waited for departure. The captain betrayed them. He'd already been paid by the authorities to turn them in. Soldiers boarded the ship, arrested everyone and marched them back to shore. They were imprisoned, interrogated, and humiliated. Their possessions were searched. Their money was confiscated. Some were held for weeks. Eventually most were released, partly because the local magistrates didn't know what to do with them, and partly because imprisoning dozens of poor religious fanatics was expensive and pointless. But the Scrooby group wasn't deterred. They were true believers, which meant they interpreted setbacks as tests of faith rather than signs they should give up and blend in like normal people. In the spring of 1608 they tried again. This time they hired a Dutch captain and arranged to meet his ship on a desolate beach between Grimsby and Hull. The plan: women and children would come by boat down the Humber River, while the men walked overland to the rendezvous point. Simple. Foolproof. Naturally, everything went wrong. The men arrived first. They waited on the beach, shivering in the March wind, scanning the horizon, for both the Dutch ship and the riverboat carrying their families. The ship appeared first, and the captain, anxious about English patrol boats, sent a small boat ashore to start loading passengers immediately. Several men scrambled aboard. They were pulling the boat back toward the ship when they spotted the riverboat arriving. Perfect timing, right? Wrong. The riverboat ran aground on a sandbar. The women and children were stuck, screaming for help, while the tide went out and left them stranded in the mud. The men on the beach tried to wade out to help, but the muck was too deep. Meanwhile, the Dutch captain saw a large group of armed men riding hard toward the beach. Local authorities who'd been tipped off. He panicked. He'd already taken some passengers aboard. If he waited for the rest, everyone would be captured and he'd lose his ship. So he left. He sailed away with about a dozen Separatist men aboard and left the women, children and remaining men stranded in the mud surrounded by soldiers. The men aboard the ship were devastated. They'd left their wives and children behind. The Dutch captain promised to take them to Amsterdam, but they didn't even know if their families would survive arrest. The voyage turned nightmarish almost immediately. A massive storm hit the North Sea, battering the ship for 14 days. Waves swept the deck. The ship nearly capsized. Water poured into the hold. Even the sailors gave up hope and prepared to die. The Separatist passengers, because of course they did, starting praying loudly and singing psalms in a hurricane while drowning. Miraculously, the ship survived. They limped into Amsterdam harbour half dead, traumatised, and separated from their families. Back in England, the captured group faced a different nightmare. The authorities arrested them, but quickly realised they had a problem. What do you do with dozens of women and children whose crime was trying to leave the country? You can't execute them. You can't really imprison them long term. You certainly can't send them home. They'd already sold their homes to fund the escape attempt. The magistrates shuffled them between towns, trying to find someone else to deal with them, until eventually, in exasperation, they let them go. Over the following months, the scattered Separatists trickled into Amsterdam in small groups, using different routes and ships, until most of the congregation had reunited. They'd made it. They were free to worship as they pleased. They were safe from English persecution. They were also completely unprepared for Dutch society. Amsterdam in 1608 was one of the richest, most cosmopolitan cities in Europe. It was the financial capital of the Protestant world, a bustling port where merchants traded goods from Asia, Africa and the Americas. It was diverse, tolerant and sophisticated. The Separatists were poor, insular English farmers and craftsmen who'd spent their lives in rural Nottinghamshire. The culture shock was immediate and disorienting. Everything was different. The language, the food, the architecture, the social customs. Dutch people wore different clothes, celebrated different holidays, worked different hours. The Separatists found the Dutch too worldly, too casual about religion, too focused on business and pleasure. The Dutch, for their part, found the English refugees to be uptight, judgmental, and weirdly obsessed with everyone else's salvation. Worse, Amsterdam already had an English separatist congregation, and it was tearing itself apart. The ancient church, led by a man named Francis Johnson, had devolved into bitter infighting over church discipline, leadership, and theology. Members accused each other of heresy. Families stopped speaking. Public arguments erupted. Johnson's own brother denounced him. It was a catastrophic example of what happens when you gather strong-willed fundamentalists with no external authority to moderate disputes. The Scrooby congregation took one look at this disaster and decided to find a different city. In 1609, they moved to Leiden, about 30 miles south. It was a better fit. Leiden was smaller, quieter, and already home to several other exile communities. The Separatists rented houses in a neighbourhood near the university and tried to build a new life. William Brewster, who'd been a gentleman in England, worked as a teacher. Others became weavers, carpenters, and textile workers. They learned Dutch, sort of. They attended each other's worship services. They worked 6 days a week and rested on Sunday. They tried to maintain their English identity while adapting to Dutch culture. It was exhausting. The work was brutal. Dutch textile manufacturing was competitive and demanding. Hours were long, wages were low, and the Separatists, who'd been farmers and craftsmen in England, struggled to keep up with skilled Dutch workers. Children as young as 6 or 7 worked alongside their parents, learning trades, contributing income. There was no safety net, no social services, no going back to England. They survived through sheer determination and mutual support, pooling resources, sharing housing, helping each other weather illness and hardship. William Bradford, who would later become governor of Plymouth Colony, worked as a weaver in Leiden. He was young, idealistic, and completely committed to the separatist cause. Years later, he'd write about this period with mixed feelings. The Separatists had achieved their goal. They could worship freely without persecution. But freedom came with a price. They were foreigners in a foreign land, working back-breaking jobs, watching their children grow up Dutch instead of English. And that became the central problem. The Separatist children growing up in Leiden absorbed Dutch culture. They learned Dutch fluently. They made Dutch friends. They attended Dutch schools. Some joined the Dutch military. Others, tempted by the relative permissiveness of Dutch society, started skipping church, drinking in taverns, and generally behaving like normal teenagers instead of pious separatists. The older generation watched in horror as their carefully maintained English identity and religious purity eroded with each passing year. They'd fled England to preserve their faith. Now they were losing their children to Dutch culture. This wasn't paranoia, it was reality. The Separatists wanted their children to be English, to speak English, to marry other English separatists, to maintain the pure church they'd sacrificed everything to build. But Leiden offered their children opportunities, education, apprenticeships, marriages into established Dutch families, social mobility. Why would a teenager choose grinding poverty and social isolation with the Separatists when they could assimilate into prosperous Dutch society? By 1617, after nearly a decade in Leiden, the congregation faced a crisis. Their pastor, John Robinson, was ageing. William Brewster was in his 50s. The core group of original refugees from Scrooby were getting old, and the next generation was slipping away. They needed a plan. They needed somewhere they could be English, maintain their religious community and build a future for their children. Someone suggested Virginia. The English had established Jamestown in 1607, and despite catastrophic mortality rates, diseased leadership, and near-constant starvation, the colony had survived. The Virginia Company was actively recruiting settlers. They offered land grants to anyone willing to cross the Atlantic and develop the territory. It was dangerous, difficult, and far from civilization, which meant it was perfect for a group of religious separatists who wanted to be left alone. But there was a complication. The Separatists were still illegal religious dissidents in the eyes of the English government. They couldn't just show up in Virginia and expect to be welcomed. They needed official permission, legal protection, and financial backing. They needed investors willing to fund the voyage and supplies in exchange for a share of profits from whatever the colony produced. They needed to negotiate with the same English authorities who'd tried to arrest them. William Brewster and other leaders opened secret negotiations with the Virginia Company and indirectly with King James's government. They proposed forming a separate settlement within Virginia territory where they could govern themselves and practice their religion freely. In exchange, they'd develop the land, export valuable goods, and generally contribute to England's colonial ambitions. It was a pragmatic deal. The Separatists got religious freedom, England got another colonial outpost, and everyone could ignore the ideological contradictions. The negotiations dragged on for years. The Virginia Company was interested but cautious. King James's advisors were sceptical. The Separatists themselves were divided. Some wanted to go, others wanted to stay in Leiden, and everyone had opinions about leadership, financing, and risk. Meanwhile, they needed money. A lot of money. Crossing the Atlantic wasn't cheap. They needed ships, supplies, food for the voyage, tools, weapons, livestock, seeds, and enough resources to survive until the colony became self-sufficient. None of them were wealthy. They'd spent their savings fleeing England and establishing themselves in Leiden. They needed investors. Enter Thomas Weston, a London ironmonger and merchant adventurer who smelled opportunity. Weston organised a group of investors, later called the Merchant Adventurers, who agreed to fund the expedition. The terms were brutal. The Separatists would work for the investors for 7 years. Everything they produced, crops, furs, timber, fish, would be divided between the colonists and the investors. The colonists would own no land during those 7 years, build no private property, and essentially function as indentured servants to the investment group. It was a terrible deal, but it was the only deal available. By 1620, the pieces were falling into place. About half the Leiden congregation agreed to go, roughly 40 people, including families with children. They would travel to England, meet up with additional recruits, and sail to Virginia together. The other half would stay in Leiden with Pastor Robinson, waiting to see if the colony survived before committing to the journey. They sold their possessions, said tearful goodbyes, and boarded a small ship called the Speedwell for the journey from Holland to Southampton, England. There they would meet a larger ship, the Mayflower, and additional colonists recruited by the investors. The combined group would cross the Atlantic together, establish a settlement, and build a new life in the New World. Simple, right? Nothing about the next 18 months would be simple. The Speedwell was a piece of junk. This is important to understand up front, because the ship's mechanical failures would delay the expedition by months, drain their limited finances, and ultimately force them to abandon the vessel entirely. But in July 1620, as the Leiden Separatists boarded in Delfshaven, they didn't know that yet. They were optimistic, emotional, convinced they were embarking on a holy mission. The departure from Delfshaven was tearfully dramatic. Pastor John Robinson, who was staying behind with the majority of the congregation, led them in prayer and scripture reading. He gave them advice about choosing leaders, maintaining unity, and staying true to their faith. People wept. They embraced. They sang psalms. They knew they might never see each other again, and for many of them, that premonition would prove correct. Robinson would die in Leiden in 1625, never having made it to America. Several of the children being left behind would grow up Dutch, marry Dutch spouses, and forget their parents' English religious crusade. But in that moment, on the dock at Delfshaven, they believed they were witnessing something historically significant. They were right, though not in the way they imagined. They weren't escaping persecution to build a pure church. They were abandoning their families to speculate on real estate in a swamp. The Speedwell sailed to Southampton, where they found the Mayflower already waiting. The Mayflower was a merchant vessel, about 100 feet long, normally used for carrying wine and dry goods between England and France. It was owned by Christopher Jones, an experienced captain who'd been hired by the investors to transport the colonists. The ship wasn't large, wasn't particularly comfortable, and certainly wasn't designed for passengers. But it was seaworthy, which was more than could be said for the Speedwell. At Southampton, the Leiden Separatists met the rest of their travelling companions for the first time. This is where things got culturally awkward. The investors had recruited additional colonists in England to fill out the expedition. These people, later called strangers by the Separatists, were not religious radicals. They were ordinary English workers, craftsmen, and servants looking for economic opportunity. Some were single men, some were families, some were indentured servants who'd signed contracts to work for wealthier colonists. None of them cared about separating from the Church of England or building a pure church. They just wanted land and a fresh start. The two groups eyed each other suspiciously. The Separatists were tight-knit, intensely religious, and used to making collective decisions. The strangers were individualistic, secular, and accustomed to hierarchical authority. The Separatists wanted to establish a religious community governed by church elders. The strangers wanted to get rich and didn't care about anyone's theological purity. This tension would simmer throughout the voyage and explode into near mutiny before they even landed. But first, they had to actually leave Southampton, which proved surprisingly difficult. The investors, led by Thomas Weston, showed up with some bad news and some worse news. The bad news: they'd rewritten the contract to be even more exploitative. The colonists would now work 6 days a week entirely for the investors' profit, with only Sunday for their own labour. They wouldn't be allowed to build private houses or accumulate personal property for the entire 7-year term. Everything they produced would go into a common pool controlled by the investors. The worst news? They'd also shorted the colonists on supplies. The expedition was under-provisioned, underfunded, and under-equipped. And Weston wanted the colonists to reimburse him immediately for some expenses by selling off provisions they'd already purchased. The colonists were furious. They'd already agreed to terrible terms. Now those terms were worse, and they were being forced to sell supplies they'd need to survive? They refused. Weston threatened to withdraw funding entirely. The colonists called his bluff. They'd already sold everything they owned and committed to the voyage. What were they supposed to do? Go back to Leiden empty-handed? Weston stomped off in a rage, promising they'd regret their stubbornness. This left the colonists in Southampton with 2 ships, insufficient supplies, no additional funding, and a departure date that was already dangerously late in the sailing season. The ideal time to cross the Atlantic was early summer, which would allow the colonists to arrive in Virginia with enough time to build shelter and plant crops before winter. It was already late July. Every day of delay pushed them closer to disaster. They borrowed money to buy essential supplies, at predatory interest rates naturally, loaded both ships, and finally set sail on August 5th, 1620. They made it about 300 miles. The speedwell started leaking. Not a little leak. A catastrophic, ship-threatening leak that forced both vessels to put in at Dartmouth for repairs. They spent nearly 2 weeks there while shipwrights examined the speedwell, found the problem, or thought they found the problem, patched it up and declared the ship seaworthy. They set sail again on August 23rd. They made it about 200 miles farther than last time. The speedwell started leaking again, even worse than before. Water poured into the hold. The pumps couldn't keep up. Captain Jones of the Mayflower, watching the speedwell wallow in the waves, made the call. Both ships would divert to Plymouth, the nearest port, before the speedwell sank and drowned everyone aboard. Plymouth was where the expedition fell apart. The shipwrights examined the speedwell and delivered their verdict. The ship was fundamentally unseaworthy. The leaks weren't fixable. The vessel was overmasted, which meant the sails created too much stress on the hull, which caused the seams to open and let in water. To make the ship safe, they'd need to rebuild significant portions of it, a process that would take months and cost more money than the colonists could possibly raise. Modern historians have debated whether the speedwell was actually as broken as claimed, or whether its captain, a man named Reynolds, deliberately sabotaged the voyage because he'd gotten cold feet about crossing the Atlantic. The evidence is ambiguous. What's certain is that by September 1620, the expedition was stuck in Plymouth with 2 ships, dwindling supplies, mounting debts, and absolutely no margin for error. They made a brutal decision. Abandon the speedwell entirely. Consolidate everyone and everything onto the Mayflower alone. Leave behind anyone who didn't fit. This meant choosing who got to continue and who had to stay behind. Families agonized over the decision. Some chose to quit entirely. They'd sold their homes, suffered through delays, and watched their resources vanish. They'd had enough. Others volunteered to stay so that families with children could go. Still others were simply told there wasn't room. The Mayflower could hold about 102 passengers plus crew. Every person beyond that capacity increased the risk of starvation, disease, and death. 18 people from the speedwell stayed behind. Among them was Robert Cushman, who'd helped negotiate the voyage, and his family. Their son would later join the colony, but Cushman himself would never live in New England. He'd gambled on the expedition, lost everything, and had to start over in England. The 90-plus remaining colonists and their possessions were crammed into the Mayflower. The ship was now dangerously overloaded. Passengers would sleep in the 'tween deck, a dim, low-ceilinged cargo hold between the main deck and the bilge. There were no cabins, no privacy, no sanitation beyond buckets. Families hung blankets to create crude partitions. Everyone slept on the floor or in hammocks. The space reeked of unwashed bodies, vomit, urine, and damp wood, and they hadn't even left port yet. On September 6th, 1620, more than a month after they were supposed to depart, the Mayflower finally left Plymouth for real. By this point, it was insanely late in the season. They'd missed the optimal weather window. They'd be crossing the Atlantic in autumn, when storms were common and conditions were brutal. If they survived the crossing, they'd arrive in Virginia in November or December, the worst possible time to start building a settlement from scratch. The first few days were calm. Passengers stayed on deck, breathing fresh air, watching the English coast disappear. Some felt excitement. Others felt dread. Many felt sick. Seasickness hit almost immediately once they entered open ocean, and it didn't stop, for weeks. The voyage across the Atlantic took 66 days. For context, that's longer than most modern people spend on vacation in an entire year. Imagine spending 66 days trapped in a dark, damp basement with 100 other people, no bathroom, no fresh food, constant nausea, and legitimate fear of drowning at any moment. Now imagine doing it voluntarily. The 'tween deck was hell. The ceiling was about 5 feet high, which meant most adults couldn't stand upright. Daylight barely penetrated. The air was thick with the smell of human waste, vomit, and rotting food. Passengers slept packed together like cargo, rocked by waves that never stopped. Children cried, adults argued, everyone was cold, wet, and miserable. The ship's crew made it worse. Sailors regarded passengers as nuisances at best and superstitious deadweight at worst. They cursed at the colonists, mocked their religious prayers, and generally treated them with contempt. One sailor in particular, whose name sadly wasn't recorded, made it his personal mission to torment the Separatists. He called them weak, told them they'd die in the wilderness, and cheerfully predicted he'd be throwing their corpses overboard before the voyage was done. He bragged that he'd personally profit from auctioning off their possessions after they died. This sailor was, by all accounts, a genuinely unpleasant person. William Bradford described him as proud and very profane, which in Separatist language meant he was an insufferable asshole. The colonists endured his abuse with grim determination, praying for patience and probably fantasizing about divine retribution. They got it. Midway through the voyage, the cruel sailor got sick. Really sick. Some kind of acute illness, possibly sepsis from an infected wound, possibly something else, struck him suddenly and violently. Within days he was dead. The sailors wrapped his body and threw it overboard. The colonists absolutely believed this was God's judgment. Bradford wrote about it with barely concealed satisfaction, noting that the sailor had mocked them for being sick, but it pleased God before they came half seas over to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner. Translation: calm as a bitch, and God has a dark sense of humour. Only one other person died during the crossing, a passenger named William Button, a servant who succumbed to illness just before they reached land. Given the conditions, the death toll could have been much higher, but the voyage still took a brutal physical and psychological toll. The storms were relentless. Autumn in the North Atlantic is notorious for vicious weather, and the Mayflower encountered multiple severe storms. Waves crashed over the deck. The ship pitched and rolled. Everything below deck got soaked. Passengers couldn't cook, couldn't light fires for warmth, couldn't do anything except huddle in the dark and pray the ship wouldn't break apart. During one particularly violent storm, the main beam, a critical structural timber supporting the deck, cracked. This was catastrophic. If the beam failed completely, the ship could literally break in half. Passengers and crew panicked. They were hundreds of miles from land in the middle of a storm, and their ship was disintegrating. Someone, probably one of the Leiden Separatists who'd worked in construction, remembered they'd brought a large iron screwjack for use in building houses in Virginia. They hauled it out, positioned it under the cracked beam, and cranked it up to support the weight. Then they braced it with timbers. It was a crude repair, but it worked. The beam held. The ship survived. The storm did have one upside. It provided entertainment. During the worst of the weather, a young man named John Howland got sick of being trapped below deck. He decided to go topside for fresh air, which was monumentally stupid. A wave immediately swept him overboard. He should have drowned. The ship was moving fast, the water was freezing, and nobody saw him go over. But Howland managed to grab a trailing rope, possibly a topsail halyard dragging in the water. He clung to it desperately while being dragged through the freezing ocean. Sailors spotted him, hauled the rope in, and fished him out of the water, half drowned but alive. Howland would go on to live until 1673, becoming one of the longest-lived Mayflower passengers and fathering 10 children. Every single one of his descendants can truthfully say their entire existence depended on their ancestor grabbing a rope while being swept into the Atlantic. As the voyage dragged on, the colonists' situation became increasingly desperate. Their food supplies were running low. The beer, which was safer to drink than water, was nearly gone. Passengers subsisted on ship's biscuits, hardtack, salt pork, dried fish, and whatever else hadn't spoiled. Fresh water became precious. Illness spread through the crowded 'tween deck. People developed scurvy, respiratory infections, and general malnutrition. The religious tension morphed into something more complex. The strangers and the Separatists were stuck together in misery, which created a kind of forced solidarity. They couldn't escape each other. They had to cooperate to survive. But the fundamental disagreement about what they were doing and why they were doing it remained unresolved. The Separatists believed they were on a religious mission ordained by God. The strangers believed they were on a business venture that was looking increasingly stupid. This difference in worldview would come to a head when they finally reached land, because when they did, they wouldn't be in Virginia. On November 9th, 1620, after 66 days at sea, someone spotted land. The colonists rushed on deck, squinting at the distant shoreline. They'd made it. They'd survived the crossing. They were in Virginia, except they weren't. Captain Christopher Jones studied the coastline and delivered the bad news. They were at Cape Cod, Massachusetts, about 200 miles north of their intended destination. They'd been blown off course by storms and ocean currents, and instead of the established Virginia territory, where they had legal permission to settle, they were looking at unmapped wilderness in a region controlled by a different colonial patent altogether. This was a disaster, not a we'll-figure-it-out inconvenience, a legitimate legal and practical disaster. The colonists had a patent from the Virginia Company giving them rights to settle in Virginia. That patent was worthless in New England, which fell under the jurisdiction of the Council for New England, a completely different organisation with different investors, different rules, and different legal authority. The colonists had no right to be there. They had no legal framework for governance. They had no claim to land, no protection from other colonists, and no official standing whatsoever. They were essentially squatters about to build an illegal settlement. Captain Jones suggested turning south and sailing for the Hudson River, which was technically within Virginia territory and close to their original target. Several colonists agreed. They'd come all this way, they had legal documents, they should use them. Others pointed out that it was now mid-November, winter was coming, and they'd already spent 2 months at sea. Their supplies were running out. People were sick. Trying to sail several hundred more miles in deteriorating weather was suicidal. They attempted the Hudson River anyway. They sailed south along the coast, fighting contrary winds and dangerous shoals. The waters around Cape Cod were treacherous. Hidden sandbars, strong currents, breaking waves. The Mayflower was a deep-drafted merchant ship, not a shallow-water coastal vessel. Several times they nearly ran aground. After a day of fighting the sea, Jones gave up. It was too dangerous. They'd either wreck the ship or waste weeks trying to reach Virginia, and they didn't have weeks. So they turned back to Cape Cod and anchored in what's now Provincetown Harbour. The date was November 11th, 1620. They'd reached land, but they had no legal authority to settle, no plan for governance, and no idea what to do next. And that's when the strangers decided they'd had enough of the Separatist leadership. The confrontation was predictable in hindsight. The strangers had signed up for a voyage to Virginia under the authority of the Virginia Company's patent. They'd agreed to work for the investors under specific terms tied to that legal framework. Now they were in New England with no patent, no legal structure, and no legitimate authority telling them what to do. Some of the strangers announced they would use their own liberty once they landed. Translation: they'd do whatever they wanted. They wouldn't follow the Separatist rules. They wouldn't work for the investors. They'd stake their own claims, pursue their own interests, and generally act as free agents in an ungoverned wilderness. This was logical from a purely self-interested perspective, but it threatened to shatter the entire expedition before anyone even stepped ashore. If the colonists split into competing factions immediately, they'd all die. They needed cooperation to survive, building shelter, finding food, defending against threats. Anarchy meant death. The Separatist leaders, William Bradford, William Brewster, Miles Standish and others, recognised the crisis. They needed to establish some form of legitimate authority before landing. They needed everyone to agree to a basic framework for governance. They needed a social contract, so they drafted one. The Mayflower Compact was written in the cramped captain's cabin while the ship rocked at anchor. It's a short document, about 200 words, and it's extraordinary for what it doesn't say as much as what it does. It doesn't claim divine authority. It doesn't establish religious requirements for citizenship. It doesn't create a rigid hierarchy. Instead, it establishes a simple principle. The signers agree to form a civil body politic and to create and follow just and equal laws for the good of the colony. It was, in essence, a democratic constitution created by people who didn't really believe in democracy. The Separatists were religious authoritarians who believed in rule by church elders interpreting God's will. The strangers were monarchists who believed in rule by appointed governors and inherited social hierarchy. Neither group was philosophically committed to egalitarian self-governance, but they were desperate, and desperation is a powerful motivator for compromise. On November 11th, 41 adult male colonists signed the Mayflower Compact. Women didn't sign, not because they were explicitly excluded, but because 17th century English political culture didn't recognise women as independent political actors. Servants didn't sign because they weren't legally free agents. But every free adult male, both separatists and strangers, put his name to the document. It's become mythologized as the foundation of American democracy, which is both true and absurdly overstated. True, because it established the principle of consensual self-governance in the absence of external authority. Absurdly overstated, because the signers were just trying to prevent mutiny and had no intention of creating a revolutionary political philosophy. They wanted survival, not democracy. Immediately after signing, they elected John Carver as governor. Carver was a separatist leader, wealthy, diplomatic and respected by both factions. He would serve as chief executive with the consent of the governed, a concept that sounds noble until you remember the governed were 100 starving, exhausted people trapped on a boat with no idea what to do next. Now legally organised, at least by their own reckoning, they needed to actually explore the land and find a place to settle. It was mid-November, snow would come soon, they had to move fast. But here's the thing about Cape Cod in November. It's beautiful and absolutely miserable in equal measure. The landscape is windswept, sandy, covered in scrubby vegetation and pine forests. The beaches are gorgeous, the weather is bitter. The Pilgrims, stepping ashore for the first time in over 2 months, were thrilled to be on solid ground and immediately reminded that solid ground in Massachusetts in winter is cold, wet, and hostile to human survival. The women went ashore first, not for any chivalrous reason, but because they desperately needed to wash clothes. Imagine wearing the same outfit for 2 months straight in a damp, filthy ship's hold. Everything the colonists owned was disgusting. The women spent their first day in America doing laundry in freezing water, which is both practical and deeply depressing. The men formed exploration parties. They needed fresh water, timber, and a suitable location for a settlement. They also needed to locate any Native American inhabitants, not out of friendliness, but out of prudent paranoia. The colonists knew the area was inhabited. They didn't know if those inhabitants would be hostile, helpful, or indifferent. The first expedition departed on November 15th. 16 men, led by Miles Standish, a professional soldier and the colony's military commander, set out to explore the area around Provincetown Harbour. They were armed with muskets, armour, and a healthy dose of fear. None of them had any wilderness experience. None spoke any native languages. They were English farmers and craftsmen pretending to be frontiersmen. Within hours they spotted their first Native Americans, 5 or 6 men with a dog, walking along the beach about a mile away. The colonists tried to approach them. The native group saw the armed English strangers and understandably ran into the woods. The colonists followed, crashing through the forest, trying to track them. This is darkly comical if you picture it. 16 armoured Englishmen, exhausted from months at sea, stumbling through unfamiliar terrain, trying to catch people who knew every inch of the landscape. The Native Americans vanished. The colonists got lost. Night fell. They camped in the woods, built a fire, posted guards, and spent a miserable night convinced they were about to be attacked. They weren't. The local Wampanoag people were keeping their distance and assessing the situation. These weren't the first Europeans they'd encountered, not by a long shot. European fishermen and traders had been visiting the coast for decades. Some encounters had been peaceful, others had been violent. In 1614, an English captain named Thomas Hunt had kidnapped about 20 Wampanoag men and sold them into slavery in Spain. The Wampanoag had excellent reasons to be cautious around armed Europeans. The next day, the exploration party found something that both excited and disturbed them: an abandoned cornfield. The corn had been harvested, but scattered ears remained. The colonists, who were running out of food, saw this as providential. They gathered all the corn they could find, about 10 bushels, and decided they'd borrow it. They told themselves they'd repay the owners eventually. They rationalised that the corn appeared abandoned. They convinced themselves God had provided for their needs. What they actually did was steal food from Native Americans who'd stored it for winter. The corn belonged to Wampanoag farmers who'd buried it in baskets and pits to preserve it. The colonists took it anyway, because starvation has a way of making people flexible about property rights. This theft would poison relations for months. The Wampanoag knew exactly who took their corn. They'd been watching the entire time. The exploration party also found graves, native burial sites that European colonists had a terrible habit of desecrating. Some colonists wanted to dig up the graves to see what was inside, driven by curiosity and greed. Others objected, either out of decency or superstition. They compromised by digging up some graves, but not others, which is peak. Colonial moral reasoning will only rob half the dead. They found burial goods, tools, bowls, and personal items interred with the deceased. They took some, they reburied the rest. They probably felt conflicted about it, but not conflicted enough to stop. These early expeditions set the tone for everything that followed. The colonists were desperate, pragmatic, and willing to do ethically questionable things to survive. They weren't uniquely evil. Plenty of colonial expeditions were far worse, but they weren't innocent either. They were human beings making bad decisions under extreme pressure and justifying those decisions through a combination of religious faith and cultural superiority. Back at the ship, conditions were deteriorating. More people were getting sick. The cold was brutal. Living on the Mayflower at anchor was only marginally better than living on the Mayflower at sea. They needed to find a settlement location immediately. A second, larger expedition set out in early December. This time they took the ship's small boat, called a shallop, which had been stored in pieces during the crossing and required reassembly. About 30 men crammed into the shallop and sailed south along the inner coast of Cape Cod, exploring inlets and harbours. The weather was getting worse. Snow fell. Ice formed in the shallop. Men's clothes froze to their bodies. Several developed frostbite. This was December in New England, and they were sailing in an open boat with inadequate clothing and no experience with this climate. Modern historians sometimes romanticize the Pilgrims as hardy frontiersmen. In reality, they were unprepared English people slowly dying of exposure. They found another abandoned native village, more evidence of the demographic catastrophe that had struck the region a few years earlier. Between 1616 and 1619, a massive epidemic, possibly bubonic plague, possibly leptospirosis, possibly something else, had killed an estimated 90% of the native population along the Massachusetts coast. Entire villages had been wiped out. Survivors had fled inland or joined other communities. The coastal areas the Pilgrims were exploring had been densely populated just a few years earlier. Now, they were graveyards. The colonists saw this as divine providence. They believed God had cleared the land for them. They interpreted mass death as a sign they were meant to settle there. William Bradford would later write that the epidemic had made the land not only void of any inhabitants, but also void of any to resist their taking possession. This is one of those moments where historical perspective matters. From the colonists' viewpoint, the empty land was a miracle. From the Wampanoag perspective, it was genocide followed by invasion. Both things can be true simultaneously. The exploration party pushed deeper into Cape Cod, looking for a suitable harbour and settlement site. On the night of December 7th, they camped on a beach. They built a barricade of logs, posted guards, and tried to sleep. Around midnight, they heard terrible sounds in the woods. Howling, screaming, what sounded like human voices but distorted and inhuman. The guards woke everyone. Men grabbed weapons. They stood in the darkness, listening to the sounds circle their camp. Nobody slept. At dawn, the noises stopped. They assumed wolves, possibly Native Americans trying to scare them. Nobody knew for sure. They prayed, ate a cold breakfast, and continued loading the shallop. Suddenly arrows started flying out of the woods. The colonists dove for cover. Men scrambled for muskets. The attack came from about 30 Wampanoag warriors hidden in the tree line. Arrows hit the barricade. One struck the mast of the shallop. Another hit a colonist's coat hanging on a pole. Miles Standish and a few others grabbed muskets and fired back. The muskets were loud, terrifying, and inaccurate at range, but the noise was effective. The warriors retreated slightly. The colonists reloaded, a process that took nearly a minute with matchlock muskets. The warriors shot more arrows. The colonists fired again. One colonist, probably acting on adrenaline and stupidity, charged toward the tree line with his musket, screaming. The warriors retreated into the woods. The shooting stopped. The entire engagement lasted maybe 10 minutes. Nobody died. Nobody was seriously injured. But the message was clear. The Native Americans were not friendly, and the colonists were not welcome. The colonists called this skirmish the First Encounter, which has a mildly awkward biblical resonance given that first encounters are supposed to be friendly meetings, not firefights. They loaded the shallop in a panic and sailed away from the beach as fast as possible, desperate to put distance between themselves and the warriors who'd just tried to kill them. They couldn't go back to Provincetown. They needed to find somewhere else to settle, and they needed to find it now. On December 9th, the shallop reached the area around modern-day Plymouth. The harbour was deep, protected, and navigable. Fresh water was available from a brook. There were cleared fields from the abandoned native village. Crucially, it was defensible, sitting on a hill with good sight lines. The location had another advantage the colonists didn't immediately appreciate. It was the site of Patuxet, a Wampanoag village that had been completely destroyed by the 1616-1619 epidemic. Not a single inhabitant had survived. The fields the colonists saw had been cultivated by people who were now dead. The reason nobody was shooting arrows at them here was because there was nobody left to shoot arrows. The colonists explored the area for a few days, took measurements, discussed the pros and cons, and decided this was as good as they'd find. On December 16th, the Mayflower sailed from Provincetown to Plymouth Harbour. The entire colony, everyone who'd survived the voyage and the explorations, would settle here. They'd found their home. Now they just had to survive it. The work began immediately. They needed houses, and they needed them fast. The plan was simple: build a communal storage building first, then individual family houses. Everyone would work together. Nobody would prioritise their own shelter over the group's needs. This is where theory met reality, and reality won decisively. December in coastal Massachusetts is brutally cold. Daytime temperatures hover around freezing. Nights drop well below. The colonists were building with hand tools using unfamiliar timber in weather that made manual labour excruciating. Their hands cracked and bled. Their feet froze in inadequate boots. They worked in shifts, some building while others stood guard against potential attacks, and then people started dying. The sickness started slowly in December, but by January it was an epidemic. Passengers who'd been weakened by the voyage, who'd spent months in the damp, unsanitary 'tween deck, now faced winter in an incomplete settlement. They slept in crude shelters and on the ship. They had inadequate clothing. Their diet was terrible, mostly salt pork, ship's biscuit, and whatever fish they could catch. Scurvy, pneumonia, and other respiratory infections spread rapidly. William Bradford's wife, Dorothy, died in early December. She fell off the Mayflower while it was anchored in Plymouth Harbour and drowned. The official record says it was an accident. Bradford never wrote about it. Some historians have speculated it was suicide, that she couldn't face the prospect of winter in the wilderness and chose to end her life. Nobody knows for sure. Bradford remarried quickly and never spoke of Dorothy again. By mid-January, nearly half the colonists were seriously ill. Only about a dozen people were healthy enough to work. They nursed the sick, built houses, stood guard, gathered firewood, and tried desperately to keep everyone alive. Governor John Carver and William Bradford, both sick themselves, worked alongside Miles Standish and a handful of others. The death toll accelerated. 2 or 3 people died every week. Families were devastated. The Mullins family, William, his wife, and 2 children, all died within weeks of each other. The Carver household lost multiple members. Children were orphaned. Spouses became widows and widowers. The colonists buried their dead quickly and quietly, trying to hide the graves from any Native Americans who might be watching. They didn't want the Wampanoag to know how weak they were. This period, January through March 1621, is called the starving time in Plymouth history, though that's somewhat misleading. They weren't literally starving in the sense that they had 0 food. They had some provisions. The problem was that they were dying of disease, exposure, malnutrition, and despair at a rate that made the Jamestown starving time look almost competent by comparison. By the end of winter, only about 50 colonists were still alive. Half the Mayflower passengers were dead. Both the Separatists and the strangers suffered equally. Disease doesn't care about your theological positions. Governor John Carver survived. Barely. William Bradford recovered after being so sick he couldn't stand for weeks. Miles Standish, the military commander, remained healthy throughout, which was fortunate because someone needed to be functional, while everyone else was dying. The healthy colonists, and we're talking maybe 6 to 8 people at the worst point, took care of the sick, cooked what little food they had, hauled water, and maintained the settlement. They did this not out of saintly altruism, but because letting everyone die would mean they'd die too. Mutual survival was the only survival. One man deserves particular recognition. William Brewster, the elder who'd led the Scrooby congregation out of England, worked himself to exhaustion caring for the sick. He was in his 50s, old by 17th century standards, and he spent the winter nursing people who were vomiting, delirious, and incontinent. He cleaned them. He fed them. He prayed with them. He buried them. This is the unglamorous reality of colonial survival. It wasn't noble adventures and manifest destiny. It was washing shit off dying people in freezing weather while wondering if you'd be next. The colonists buried their dead at night, in secret, in unmarked graves on the hill above the settlement. They then planted crops over the graves to disguise them. This wasn't about respect for the deceased. It was about operational security. If the Wampanoag realised how many colonists had died, they could simply wipe out the survivors. The colonists needed to project strength they didn't have. Ironically, the Wampanoag knew exactly how many colonists were left. They'd been watching the entire time. The Wampanoag were not, as the colonists sometimes portrayed them, primitive savages lurking in the wilderness. They were a sophisticated confederation of communities with complex political structures, agricultural expertise, and extensive trade networks. They'd been monitoring the English settlement since the Mayflower arrived. They knew the colonists were weak. They knew they were dying. They'd been debating what to do about them for months. The political situation was more complicated than natives versus invaders. The Wampanoag Confederation had been devastated by the epidemic. Entire villages were gone. Their population had collapsed from perhaps 50,000 to 60,000 people, down to maybe 10,000 survivors scattered across a huge territory. They were vulnerable, and they had enemies. The Narragansett people to the west had been less affected by the epidemic. They were stronger, more numerous, and increasingly aggressive toward the weakened Wampanoag. The Wampanoag Sachem, paramount chief, was a man named Massasoit, and he was playing a desperate game of survival politics. He needed allies. He needed military support. He needed something to offset the Narragansett threat. The English colonists, for all their weakness, had guns, loud, terrifying guns that could kill at range. They also had steel weapons, armour, and demonstrated willingness to use violence. From Massasoit's perspective, these sick, starving English people might be useful. So the Wampanoag waited through the winter, watching the colonists die, assessing their capabilities, and debating internally about whether to attack them, ignore them, or approach them diplomatically. By March, the decision was made. They would make contact. On March 16, 1621, a Wampanoag man walked into Plymouth settlement, raised his hand, and said in clear English, "Welcome, Englishmen." The colonists understandably lost their minds. The man's name was Samoset. He was not local, he was Abenaki, from the coast of Maine, about 200 miles north. He'd learned English from fishermen and traders who frequented the Maine coast. He was visiting the area and had been designated by Massasoit to make first contact with the colonists because he could communicate with them. The colonists stared at him in shock. They'd been in the wilderness for months, surrounded by people they couldn't understand, terrified of attack, and now a Native American was standing in their settlement speaking English and asking for beer. Yes, beer. Samoset's first recorded request was for beer, which the colonists didn't have because they'd run out months ago. They offered him strong water, probably brandy or aquavit, along with biscuit, butter, cheese and pudding. Samoset ate, drank and talked with them for hours. He told them about the region. He explained that the area they'd settled was called Patuxi and had been completely depopulated by disease. He described the political landscape, the different groups, their relationships, their leaders. He mentioned Massasoit, the Wampanoag Sachem, who was nearby with about 60 warriors. This last detail made the colonists nervous. 60 warriors could wipe them out easily. Samoset also told them about a man named Tisquantum, later called Squanto, who spoke even better English than Samoset did. Squanto could serve as an interpreter. He lived with Massasoit's people and would be sent to the colony soon. The colonists fed Samoset, gave him gifts, and nervously watched him leave. He promised to return with Squanto and some of the men who'd lost corn to the English theft back in November. The colonists, realising their theft was coming back to haunt them, prepared to pay for what they'd stolen. A few days later, on March 22nd, Samoset returned with Squanto, and this is where the story gets dark. Squanto's full story is one of the most tragic and complicated narratives in early American history. He was from Patuxet, the very village whose site the Pilgrims had settled. He'd lived there, farmed there, had family and community there. In 1614, he and about 19 other Wampanoag men had been kidnapped by Thomas Hunt, the English slave trader mentioned earlier. Hunt had sailed to Spain and sold them into slavery. Squanto somehow ended up in England, either escaping slavery or being purchased and freed by someone sympathetic. He learned English fluently. He lived in London for several years. He worked with merchants and explorers who were interested in New England. In 1619, he finally managed to book passage back to America with a fishing expedition. He returned to find Patuxet empty. Everyone was dead. His family, his friends, His entire community had been killed by disease while he was in Europe. The fields he'd worked were overgrown. The houses were collapsed. The burial grounds were the only evidence people had lived there at all. Squanto had been enslaved, transported thousands of miles from home, spent years in a foreign country, and finally returned to discover everyone he'd ever known was dead, and strangers were building houses on top of their graves. And now those strangers needed his help to survive. The psychological complexity of Squanto's position is staggering. He could have walked away. He could have encouraged Massasoit to attack the colonists. He could have let them starve. Instead, he chose to help them, for reasons that are still debated by historians. Maybe he wanted to maintain connections to English trade networks. Maybe he saw an opportunity for personal power and status. Maybe he felt some obligation to help people who were suffering as he had suffered. Maybe he was just practical and recognised that the English weren't going away, so cooperation was smarter than resistance. Whatever his motivations, Squanto became the colonists' interpreter, guide, and agricultural instructor. Without him, Plymouth Colony would almost certainly have failed. On March 22nd, 1621, Massasoit himself came to Plymouth with about 60 men. This was the diplomatic meeting the colonists had been nervously anticipating. Both sides were armed, both sides were cautious, both sides needed something from the other. The meeting was formal and ritualized. Massasoit brought gifts, furs and food. The colonists offered gifts, a copper chain, knives and jewellery. They shared a meal. They drank liquor. The colonists had saved some for diplomatic purposes. They negotiated through Squanto, who translated between English and Wampanoag. The result was a treaty, an actual formal treaty between Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag Confederation. The terms were straightforward. Neither side would harm the other. If anyone broke the peace, they'd be handed over for punishment. If one side was attacked by a third party, the other would come to their aid. When visiting each other's settlements, people would leave their weapons behind. Both sides agreed to enforce these terms on their respective people. It was, by 17th century standards, a remarkably equitable treaty. There were no provisions about land, ownership, no assertions of English superiority, no religious conversion requirements, just mutual defence and peaceful coexistence. The treaty held for more than 50 years, which is extraordinary. It lasted because both sides needed each other. The Wampanoag got English military support and trade goods. The English got agricultural knowledge, diplomatic protection, and access to resources they couldn't obtain alone. Squanto stayed in Plymouth as a permanent resident and interpreter. He taught the colonists how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, a technique that became iconic in Thanksgiving mythology. The reality is more complex than the myth suggests. Squanto showed them how to plant corn seeds in mounds with alewives, small fish, buried beneath to provide nitrogen. This worked, but it was labour-intensive and required catching thousands of fish during spawning runs. He also taught them which wild plants were edible, how to hunt local game, where to find shellfish, and how to avoid poisonous species. He explained seasonal patterns, when fish would run, when deer would migrate, when to plant and harvest. He essentially provided a crash course in surviving in coastal New England. The colonists, to their credit, listened. They planted 20 acres of corn using Squanto's methods. They planted peas, barley and wheat using English techniques. They fished, hunted and gathered. They worked alongside the Wampanoag, who taught them practical skills and tolerated their presence. Spring became summer. The colonists regained their strength. The death rate dropped to 0. People who'd been sick recovered. The settlement, which had felt like a death camp in February, started to feel like a functioning community by June. But there were complications. Squanto wasn't just a helpful interpreter. He was also a political operator who used his unique position for personal advantage. He was the only person who could communicate fluently between the English and the Wampanoag. This gave him enormous power, which he exploited ruthlessly. Squanto started telling other native groups that the English had plague buried under their storehouse, and would release it on anyone who opposed them. He told the colonists that various Wampanoag communities were planning attacks, and only he could negotiate peace. He played both sides against each other, positioning himself as indispensable while undermining Massasoit's authority. Massasoit figured out what Squanto was doing and demanded the English hand him over for execution. This created a diplomatic crisis. The colonists depended on Squanto's knowledge and translation skills, but they also depended on their treaty with Massasoit. If they refused to hand over Squanto, they'd violate the treaty and possibly trigger war. If they handed him over, they'd lose their interpreter and agricultural advisor. William Bradford, now serving as governor after John Carver died of sunstroke in April, had to navigate this impossible situation. He stalled, he argued, he negotiated. Eventually a compromise was reached. Squanto would stay with the English but would stop his political scheming. Massasoit accepted this grudgingly, and the crisis passed. But it revealed something important. The Plymouth colonists weren't powerful conquerors imposing their will on native peoples. They were weak, dependent, and constantly negotiating their survival within a complex political landscape they barely understood. The summer of 1621 was productive. The corn grew well. The English crops, barley and peas, did reasonably well. The wheat failed completely, unsuited to New England's climate and soil. They harvested wild berries, caught fish, shot waterfowl and gathered shellfish. They traded with local native communities, exchanging English goods for furs and food. By autumn, they had enough food stored to survive another winter. This was a massive achievement. They'd landed in November 1620 with inadequate supplies. Half of them had died. The survivors had endured unimaginable hardship. And now, 1 year later, they were stable. In September 1621, Governor Bradford decided to celebrate. They'd survived. They'd harvested their first crops. They had a treaty with their neighbours. They had reason for cautious optimism. Bradford declared a 3-day celebration of Thanksgiving. Not a religious holy day, but a harvest festival. This wasn't unusual. Harvest festivals were common in both English and Wampanoag cultures. The English had celebrated harvest home festivals for centuries. The Wampanoag held regular ceremonies of Thanksgiving connected to planting, harvesting, and hunting. What made this particular celebration notable was that it was a joint celebration between the colonists and the Wampanoag. Bradford sent 4 men hunting for fowl. They killed enough ducks, geese, and turkeys to feed the colony for a week. The women prepared food using English and native ingredients: cornbread, boiled squash, roasted venison, seafood, dried berries. They cooked outside in the autumn air, probably grateful to not be crammed into tiny houses. Massasoit heard about the celebration and showed up with 90 men. The colonists had been planning to feed about 50 people. Now they had to feed 140. This is classic. We invited a few people over energy, escalating into a full-scale diplomatic banquet. Massasoit, demonstrating both generosity and political savvy, had his men hunt 5 deer as a contribution. The Wampanoag guests brought other food as well, including probably eels, shellfish, and corn. The celebration lasted 3 days. They ate, drank, played games, and held shooting competitions, both English musketry and Wampanoag archery. The Wampanoag men were better shots, which must have been humbling for Miles Standish and his soldiers. They socialised, negotiated, reinforced their treaty, and generally engaged in the kind of diplomatic socialising that cements alliances. This was not Thanksgiving as modern Americans understand it. There was no turkey as the centrepiece, though wild turkeys were probably eaten. There were no cranberries, or if there were, they weren't prepared as sauce. There were no mashed potatoes. Potatoes hadn't been introduced to North America yet. There was no pumpkin pie. The colonists had neither ovens nor sufficient sugar. What they did have was venison, waterfowl, corn, squash, fish, shellfish, and probably beer or wine. They sat outside. The houses were too small for 140 people. They ate with their hands or crude utensils. They probably got drunk. They definitely made noise, because English celebrations were loud, and Wampanoag celebrations involved drumming and dancing. The colonists didn't call it Thanksgiving. That term wouldn't be applied to this event for another 200 years. Edward Winslow, one of the colonists, wrote a letter describing the celebration, but he didn't frame it as particularly significant. It was just a harvest festival that went well. The colonists held religious Thanksgiving days at other times. Solemn days of prayer and fasting, not festive meals. The modern Thanksgiving holiday, with its mythology of pilgrims and Indians sharing a harmonious meal, was invented in the 19th century. Sarah Josepha Hale, a magazine editor, campaigned for decades to establish a national Thanksgiving holiday. Abraham Lincoln finally declared it in 1863 during the Civil War as a way to unify the country. The Pilgrims' 1621 harvest celebration was retroactively identified as the first Thanksgiving and mythologized into a founding moment of American identity. The mythology erases the complexity. It erases the fact that the Wampanoag weren't naive natives welcoming friendly Europeans. They were strategic political actors, making calculated decisions for survival. It erases the fact that the Plymouth colonists weren't grateful recipients of native charity. They were desperate survivors stealing corn and negotiating from weakness. It erases the fact that the peaceful coexistence didn't last, and within decades the same communities that shared that harvest feast would be at war. The celebration ended. The Wampanoag went home. The colonists cleaned up and prepared for their second winter in New England. They were in a dramatically better position than the previous year. They had shelter, food stores, and diplomatic relationships. They weren't going to die en masse this time, but they were still deeply in debt, profoundly isolated, and operating on borrowed time before their investors demanded returns. The Fortune arrived in November 1621, carrying 35 new colonists and absolutely zero supplies. The ship's captain, Thomas Barton, handed Governor Bradford a furious letter from the investors. Where were the profits? Where were the furs, the timber, the fish, the trade goods that were supposed to repay the investment? The colony had been established for a year. The investors wanted their money back. Bradford read the letter and probably wanted to throw it into the ocean. The investors, sitting comfortably in London, had no concept of what the colonists had endured. Half the original passengers had died. The survivors had spent months nursing the sick, building houses, and negotiating with the people whose land they'd occupied. They'd barely survived, and now they were being scolded for not generating profits fast enough. Bradford wrote back, and his response is one of the most passive-aggressive documents in colonial history. He explained, with painstaking detail, exactly what had happened. The deaths, the starvation, the lack of support from the investors, the fact that the new colonists had arrived with no food, no tools, and no resources, which meant the existing colonists would have to support them through winter, further depleting their stores. Then he loaded the Fortune with whatever trade goods they'd managed to accumulate, furs, timber, sassafras, and sent it back to England. The ship was captured by French pirates in the English Channel. The investors got nothing. The universe has a sense of irony. The 35 new colonists made life in Plymouth significantly more complicated. They weren't separatists from Leiden. They were economic migrants recruited in England who didn't share the colony's religious vision. Some were useful. Craftsmen, labourers, people with needed skills. Others were gentlemen expecting servants and easy living. None of them understood what they'd signed up for. One passenger was particularly notable. Robert Cushman, the same man who'd stayed behind when the Speedwell failed. He'd come to Plymouth to deliver a sermon and assess the colony's viability. His sermon, delivered in December 1621, was about the dangers of self-interest and the necessity of communal cooperation. It was a pointed critique of colonists who prioritised personal gain over group survival, which was hilarious, because the entire colonial venture was a profit-seeking enterprise funded by capitalist investors. Cushman sailed back to England in January 1622 on the Fortune, before it was captured by pirates, and never returned to Plymouth. He'd seen enough. The colony was surviving, but it wasn't thriving, and he wasn't interested in grinding poverty for the sake of religious purity. The arrival of new colonists highlighted a fundamental tension in Plymouth's economy. The communal labour system wasn't working. According to their agreement with the investors, all colonists worked collectively. Everything produced went into a common store. Food, goods, profits, all shared equally regardless of individual effort. This sounds lovely in theory. In practice, it created resentment and inefficiency. Strong workers resented carrying weak workers. Families with many working-age members resented feeding families with young children who couldn't contribute labour. Young single men resented working to support other men's families. The system eliminated individual incentives and rewarded free riding. William Bradford, in his History of Plymouth, wrote candidly about the problem. He described how the communal system was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. People worked slowly, complained constantly, and felt exploited. Women resented being commanded to cook and clean for men who weren't their husbands. Men resented working fields that would feed others equally regardless of effort. Bradford's solution, implemented in 1623, was radical. Give each family a private plot of land. Let them keep what they produced. Maintain a communal labour requirement for essential projects, but allow private agriculture for everything else. This was basically capitalism. It worked immediately. Productivity increased. People worked longer hours on their own plots than they ever had on communal fields. Women who'd refused to work collectively suddenly laboured enthusiastically on family farms. The amount of corn planted increased dramatically. Food stores grew. The colony became more self-sufficient. Bradford's own words are telling. This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. He then added, somewhat snarkily, that it proved the vanity of that conceit that communal property could work based on idealism alone. So the Pilgrims, radical religious separatists who'd fled England to build a pure godly community, discovered that private property and self-interest were more effective than collective sharing and spiritual devotion. They'd accidentally proven capitalism works better than communalism, which must have been theologically awkward for people whose entire identity was based on rejecting worldly materialism. Meanwhile, their relationship with the Wampanoag was evolving in complicated ways. The treaty held. There was no open warfare. Trade continued. But trust was fragile and incidents kept testing the alliance. In 1622, colonists heard rumours, possibly from Squanto, possibly from other native sources, that Massasoit had been captured by the Narragansett and was being held hostage. This was a crisis. If Massasoit died or was deposed, the treaty was void and Plymouth would be vulnerable. Miles Standish took a small group of armed men to investigate. They found Massasoit sick, not captured. He'd contracted some illness, possibly pneumonia, possibly something else, and was close to death. The colonists, recognising a diplomatic opportunity, nursed him back to health. They gave him medicine, fed him chicken broth, and stayed with him until he recovered. Massasoit, grateful for their care, warned them about a rumoured plot. According to his intelligence, the Massachusetts people, a different native group to the north, were planning to attack both the Wampanoag and the English. He suggested the colonists strike first. This is where things get morally complicated. Miles Standish took 8 men to confront the Massachusetts leaders. What happened next depends on whose account you believe. The English version, they were defending themselves against treachery. The native version, they were murdered during a diplomatic meeting. Standish and his men killed several Massachusetts leaders, including a man named Wituwamat. Standish brought Wituwamat's head back to Plymouth and mounted it on a pike on the fort as a warning. This was brutal even by 17th century standards. It was meant to send a message. The English would use preemptive violence to protect themselves. Don't threaten Plymouth. The message was received. It also permanently damaged Plymouth's reputation among native peoples. The massacre, because that's what it was, demonstrated that the English couldn't be trusted, even in diplomatic settings. Word spread. Other native groups became more cautious, more hostile, more convinced that the English were dangerous. John Robinson, the pastor back in Leiden, heard about the incident and wrote Bradford a letter expressing his disappointment. Robinson was no pacifist. He accepted the necessity of defensive violence, but he felt Standish had been too eager to use force. He worried the colony was becoming militaristic and losing its spiritual focus. Robinson had a point. The colony was changing. Survival required pragmatism, and pragmatism often conflicted with religious idealism. The Separatists had come to build a pure church community. They were becoming armed settlers in a contested territory, making brutal decisions to maintain their position. But they were also growing. More ships arrived. more colonists joined. The population of Plymouth increased slowly but steadily through the 1620s. Each new arrival brought skills, labour and more mouths to feed. The settlement expanded from the original hilltop cluster to include scattered farms and houses along the coast. The colonists established trade relationships with native groups beyond the Wampanoag. They bought furs, beaver, otter, mink, and shipped them to England. The fur trade was profitable, finally generating returns for the investors. It also created competition and conflict with other English settlements that were beginning to appear along the coast. In 1623, ships began arriving at other points in New England, establishing competing colonies. The Massachusetts Bay Colony would be founded in 1630 with far more resources, organisation, and Puritan settlers than Plymouth ever had. These new colonists looked down on Plymouth as poor, disorganised, and religiously suspect. The Separatists had fled England to escape persecution. The Puritans were arriving to build a proper English society with themselves in charge. Plymouth suddenly found itself surrounded by rivals who had more money, more people, and more political connections than they did. The scrappy, little colony that had barely survived its first years was now the weak link in a growing network of English settlements. But in the early 1620s, Plymouth was still relatively isolated. Life was difficult but stable. The colonists worked their farms, traded with native peoples, attended church services, and tried to maintain their English identity while adapting to American realities. Daily life in Plymouth was grinding and repetitive. Men worked the fields from dawn to dusk, planting, weeding, harvesting. Women managed households, cooked, cleaned, made clothes, preserved food, and cared for children. Children worked alongside adults as soon as they were physically capable. There was no childhood as modern people understand it. Kids weren't playing games all day. They were hauling water, feeding chickens, weeding gardens, and learning trades. The houses were small, dark, and cold. Most were single-room structures with thatched roofs and wattle and daub walls. A central fireplace provided heat and cooking facilities. Furniture was minimal: tables, benches, maybe a chest for storage. People slept on mattresses stuffed with straw or corn husks. Privacy didn't exist. Entire families lived, ate, and slept in one room. Food was monotonous. The colonists ate corn in various forms: cornbread, porridge, roasted corn. They ate beans, squash, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat came from hunting and fishing: venison, wild birds, fish, shellfish. They preserved food through salting, smoking, and drying. Fresh food was available only seasonally. Winter meant eating preserved provisions that were boring at best and rancid at worst. They drank beer and cider when available, water when necessary. Beer was safer than water and provided calories. The colonists brewed their own using grain and whatever they could find for flavouring. It was weak beer by modern standards, but it was better than risking dysentery from contaminated water. Clothing was practical and heavy. Men wore breeches, shirts, doublets and hats. Women wore shifts, petticoats, bodices and caps. Everything was made from wool, linen or leather. Colours were natural: browns, greys, off-whites. The Puritan stereotype of all black clothing is myth. Dyes were expensive and most colonists wore whatever colours were practical. They washed clothes infrequently because washing was labour-intensive. You heated water, scrubbed fabric with lye soap, rinsed, and hung everything to dry. In winter, this was nearly impossible. People wore dirty clothes for weeks or months. Everyone stank. You just got used to it. Personal hygiene was minimal by modern standards. Bathing was rare, maybe a few times a year. People wiped down with cloths dipped in water. They cleaned their teeth with rags. They used outdoor privies for waste. Menstruating women used rags that were washed and reused. Diapers didn't exist. Babies wore long shirts and parents dealt with the mess. Disease was constant. Colonists suffered from dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and various fevers. Medical knowledge was primitive. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, herbal remedies, and prayer. Many conditions that are easily treatable today were death sentences in 1620s Plymouth. An infected tooth could kill you. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and child. A simple cut could become septic and cost you a limb or your life. Children died frequently. Infant mortality was horrific. Perhaps a third of children died before age 5. Parents had large families partially because they expected to lose multiple children. This created a strange emotional dynamic where parents loved their children, but also maintained psychological distance because attachment meant deeper grief when death came, and death came often. The cemetery on the hill above Plymouth grew steadily. The colonists buried people without elaborate ceremonies, a prayer, a burial shroud, a simple grave marker if you were lucky. Headstones were expensive. Most people got wooden markers that rotted away within years. Religious life was central to the colony's identity, but less rigid than popular mythology suggests. The Separatists held 2 services every Sunday, morning and afternoon. Services were long, sermon-focused, and conducted in plain language. There was no liturgy, no set prayers, no clerical robes. The church was the community, not a building. They met in the common house until they could build a dedicated meeting house. But here's the thing. A significant portion of Plymouth's population weren't Separatists. The strangers who joined the voyage had no particular commitment to Separatist theology. They attended services because it was expected, not because they were spiritually invested. This created tension. The Separatists wanted a pure church of committed believers. Instead, they had a mixed community of varying religious commitment. This theological compromise would define Plymouth's character. Unlike the later Massachusetts Bay Colony, which enforced strict religious conformity and expelled dissenters, Plymouth was forced to tolerate diversity because they lacked the power to do otherwise. They couldn't expel people who disagreed with them. They needed every colonist for labour and defence. So Plymouth became, accidentally and reluctantly, somewhat tolerant. Not because they believed in tolerance as a principle, but because practical necessity forced accommodation. Governance was similarly pragmatic. William Bradford served as governor for most of Plymouth's existence, over 30 years total. He was re-elected repeatedly not because the colonists loved democracy, but because Bradford was competent, pragmatic, and willing to do the job. Elections were held annually, but they usually just reaffirmed Bradford and a small group of assistants. Laws were minimal and enforced inconsistently. The colony had no formal legal code for years. They just made decisions based on English common law, biblical principles, and whatever seemed reasonable. This informality would cause problems later as the colony grew and disputes became more complex. The economy remained precarious throughout the 1620s. The colonists produced enough food to survive but struggled to generate the exports needed to repay their debts. The fur trade helped, but competition from other colonies and fluctuating market prices made profits unpredictable. In 1627, the colonists negotiated a new arrangement with the investors. A group of 8 men, called the Undertakers, agreed to assume the colony's debt in exchange for a monopoly on the fur trade. The Undertakers would pay off the investors over time, while the other colonists continued farming and building the settlement. This was essentially privatization. The communal economy was replaced by a system where a small group of wealthy colonists controlled the most profitable trade, while everyone else worked their individual farms. It was more efficient and more unequal. The Undertakers got rich. Everyone else stayed poor. William Bradford was one of the Undertakers, which means he personally profited from the arrangement. This isn't a scandal. He was governor and had every right to participate in the colony's economy. But it does complicate the narrative of selfless communal leadership. Bradford made pragmatic financial decisions that benefited himself while maintaining his role as spiritual and political leader. Meanwhile, the relationship with the Wampanoag continued to evolve. Squanto died in 1622, probably of disease, removing one of the key links between the two communities. The colonists found other interpreters, notably a man named Hobbamock, who was loyal to Massasoit and served as both interpreter and diplomat. Hobbamock was less manipulative than Squanto, and more trusted by both sides. Trade continued. The colonists and Wampanoag exchanged goods, collaborated on hunting expeditions, and maintained the treaty. But the balance of power was shifting. Every year, more English settlers arrived. Every year, native populations declined from disease and conflict. The demographic equation that had once made the Wampanoag the dominant force was slowly reversing. Massasoit recognised this. He maintained the treaty because he still needed English military support against the Narragansett and other rivals. But he also knew that eventually the English would outnumber his people, and the alliance would become irrelevant. He was buying time, hoping his sons would inherit a world where the Wampanoag could survive alongside the English. That hope would prove tragically misplaced. By the late 1620s, Plymouth Colony had achieved something remarkable. It still existed. This sounds like damning with faint praise, but consider that Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement, had lost about 80% of its colonists in the first years. The Popham colony in Maine lasted about a year before everyone gave up and went home. Roanoke vanished entirely, leaving only the word Croatoan carved into a tree and spawning centuries of creepy speculation. Plymouth survived. It didn't thrive spectacularly. It didn't make anyone rich. It didn't fulfill the grand religious vision that had motivated the original Separatists. But it survived, and in the brutal lottery of early colonial ventures, survival was victory. The colony in 1628 had maybe 180 people. That's not much growth for 8 years of settlement, but it represented stability. People were having children who survived. New colonists arrived and didn't immediately die. The settlement was expanding geographically, establishing satellite communities along the coast and inland along rivers. But Plymouth was about to be overshadowed completely. In 1628, a new group of English Puritans received a royal charter to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These weren't poor Separatists fleeing persecution. These were wealthy, well-connected Puritans with significant financial backing, political influence, and a comprehensive plan for large-scale colonization. They had everything Plymouth lacked: money, organization, and legitimacy. The Massachusetts Bay Company sent an advance party in 1628 to establish Salem. Then, in 1630, they sent the main fleet, 11 ships carrying about 700 colonists. This was the Great Migration, and it made Plymouth's original voyage look like a family camping trip. More colonists arrived in a single year than had lived in Plymouth during its entire first decade. These new Puritans were different from the Pilgrims in important ways. The Pilgrims were Separatists who'd rejected the Church of England entirely. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England from within, hence the name. The Pilgrims were radicals. The Puritans were reformers. The Pilgrims had fled England. The Puritans were establishing a city upon a hill to show England how a proper godly society should function. The Puritans also had better organisation, more resources, and superior infrastructure. They established Boston as their capital and quickly built a network of towns: Cambridge, Charlestown, Roxbury, Dorchester. They brought livestock, tools, supplies, and craftsmen. They had ministers, doctors, and educated leaders. Within a few years, Massachusetts Bay Colony had more people, more wealth, and more political power than Plymouth could ever hope to match. This created an awkward dynamic. Plymouth had been first. They'd suffered through the starving time, negotiated with the Wampanoag, established the precedent for English settlement in New England. But nobody cared. Massachusetts Bay was where the action was. Plymouth became the provincial backwater, the poor cousin, the colony that was perpetually struggling while Boston flourished. William Bradford watched this happen with mixed feelings. On one hand, more English colonists meant more security, more trade opportunities, and more English culture in the wilderness. On the other hand, the Puritans looked down on the Pilgrims as theologically incorrect and socially inferior. The Separatists had created a church without bishops, which the Puritans found radical and distasteful. The fact that Plymouth was poor, small, and relatively disorganized confirmed the Puritans' prejudices. The relationship between the two colonies was cordial but tense. They cooperated on military matters and coordinated responses to native threats. They traded with each other, but there was no affection, no sense of common cause beyond generic English Protestant solidarity. Meanwhile, the demographic collapse of native populations continued. The 1616 to 1619 epidemic had been catastrophic, but it wasn't the last plague. Diseases kept arriving with every European ship, Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. Native peoples had no immunity to these diseases. Mortality rates in some epidemics reached 90% or higher. Entire villages disappeared. Survivors merged with other communities or fled inland. The Wampanoag population, which had been around 50,000, 60,000 before European contact, dropped to perhaps 10,000 by 1620 and continued declining throughout the 1620s and 1630s. By 1675, there would be only about 1,000 Wampanoag left. This is genocide by disease, unintentional in the sense that the English didn't deliberately spread plague, but the end result was the same, the near-total destruction of an entire people. The English colonists saw this destruction as divine providence. They believed God was clearing the land for them. This theological interpretation is one of the most disturbing aspects of colonial history, because it allowed settlers to witness mass death and interpret it as proof they were righteous rather than complicit in catastrophe. Massasoit watched his people die and maintained the treaty with Plymouth because he had no better options. His political calculus had been correct in 1621. Alliance with the English provided protection against the Narragansett. But by the 1630s, the equation was changing. The English were numerous enough to be a threat themselves. More colonists meant more demand for land. More land meant encroachment on Wampanoag territory. The alliance that had saved the Wampanoag was slowly becoming their doom. In Plymouth itself, daily life continued its grinding routine. The colony's economy was based on agriculture, fishing and fur trading. Most colonists were farmers producing corn, vegetables and livestock for subsistence. A few were craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers. Some worked in the fur trade, travelling inland to trade with native peoples for beaver pelts. The colony established a grist mill in 1636, which was a major technological improvement. Before the mill, colonists had to grind corn by hand using mortars and pestles, which was exhausting. The mill used water power to grind grain efficiently, freeing up labour for other tasks. This is the kind of incremental progress that doesn't make history books exciting but makes history possible. Housing improved gradually. The original crude shelters were replaced by proper timber frame houses with shingled roofs, wooden floors, and multiple rooms. Wealthier colonists built two-storey houses with separate sleeping quarters. This wasn't luxury. It was basic comfort after years of living in drafty, cramped single-room hovels. The colonists also built defensive structures. A fort on the hill overlooking the settlement housed the militia's weapons and served as a refuge in case of attack. A palisade wall enclosed the core settlement, providing basic protection. These defences were never seriously tested, but their existence reflected ongoing anxiety about native attacks and the colony's fundamental vulnerability. Religious life became more structured as the colony grew. They built a proper meeting house and established regular patterns of worship. Services remained long and sermon-focused. The congregation elected elders and deacons to manage church affairs. They maintained discipline through public confession and censure for moral offences, adultery, drunkenness, Sabbath breaking and other sins. But the religious purity the Separatists had sought was increasingly diluted. The colony included people with varying levels of religious commitment. Some attended church out of genuine faith. Others attended because it was socially required. Children born in Plymouth grew up without the intense religious passion that had driven their parents to flee England. The second generation was more American than English, more practical than theological. This generational shift would become a crisis in later decades. The founding generation had sacrificed everything for their faith. The next generation took that sacrifice for granted and pursued ordinary lives, farming, trading, raising families. This pattern would repeat across New England. Intense founding idealism followed by gradual secularization and cultural assimilation. Plymouth also had to deal with internal conflicts that had nothing to do with religion. People fought over property boundaries, debts, and personal disputes. The colony's informal governance struggled to adjudicate these conflicts fairly. William Bradford and his assistants acted as judges, but they had limited legal authority and no formal legal code. Decisions were made based on precedent, common sense, and biblical principles, which left room for inconsistency and favouritism. One particularly messy conflict involved Thomas Morton, who established a competing trading post at Merrymount, just north of Plymouth in 1626. Morton was everything the Pilgrims hated: irreverent, pleasure-seeking, and willing to trade guns to native peoples. He and his followers drank, danced around a maypole, and engaged in activities the Puritans considered scandalous. Worse, from Plymouth's perspective, Morton was undercutting their fur, trade by offering better prices and trading weapons to native peoples. This violated both Plymouth's economic interests and their sense of moral order. Miles Standish led a raid on Merrymount, arrested Morton, and shipped him back to England. Morton returned, was arrested again, returned again, and generally made himself a thorn in Plymouth's side for years. He wrote a book mocking the Puritans and Pilgrims as hypocritical religious fanatics, which wasn't entirely wrong. The conflict was partly economic, partly cultural, and partly about competing visions of what English settlement should look like. Morton represented secular commercial colonisation. Make money, have fun, don't worry about theology. Plymouth represented religious communalism. Build a godly society, maintain moral standards, prioritise spiritual over material concerns. Morton's vision would eventually win in America, which must have horrified William Bradford's ghost. Throughout the 1630s, Plymouth's population grew slowly while Massachusetts Bay Colony exploded. The Great Migration brought about 20,000 English colonists to New England between 1630 and 1640. Most settled in Massachusetts Bay, some in Connecticut, a few in Rhode Island. Plymouth got maybe 1,000, which was significant growth for them but tiny compared to their neighbours. This demographic imbalance meant Plymouth lacked political influence. When the New England colonies formed a defensive confederation in 1643, called the New England Confederation, Plymouth was the junior partner. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Haven dominated. Plymouth contributed representatives but had little actual power. The Confederation existed primarily to coordinate military responses to native threats and coordinate policy toward native peoples. Which brings us to the dark trajectory that the alliance between Plymouth and the Wampanoag was following. By the 1640s, English colonists vastly outnumbered native peoples in southern New England. The demographic balance had completely reversed from 1620. The English no longer needed native military support. They no longer depended on native agricultural knowledge. They no longer had to negotiate carefully to maintain peace. They had the power to simply take what they wanted. Land became the central conflict. English colonists wanted land for farming, grazing, and settlement. Native peoples needed land for hunting, fishing, and their own agriculture. English property concepts, individual ownership, fixed boundaries, permanent transfer, conflicted with native concepts of communal use and seasonal mobility. When English colonists bought land from native leaders, they believed they'd purchased permanent exclusive ownership. Native leaders often believed they'd granted permission for shared use or temporary access. This fundamental misunderstanding created endless disputes. English colonists built houses and fences on land they'd purchased. Native peoples continued hunting and gathering on land they believed they still had rights to. Both sides felt betrayed. Both sides accused the other of treaty violations. Violence became more common. Massasoit died in 1661. In his 80s, having maintained the treaty with Plymouth for 40 years. His son Wamsuta, whom the English called Alexander, became Sachem. Wamsuta died mysteriously in 1662, possibly of disease, possibly of poisoning, after being seized by Plymouth authorities for questioning about land sales. His death infuriated his brother Metacom, called King Philip by the English, who became the new Sachem. Metacom inherited an impossible situation. The Wampanoag had lost most of their land, most of their population, and most of their autonomy. They were surrounded by English settlements, subject to English courts, and increasingly treated as subordinate rather than equal treaty partners. Metacom tried to maintain peace, but he also prepared for war. In 1675, war came. King Philip's War was the most destructive conflict in American history relative to population. About 30% of English colonists in New England were killed or displaced, and about 60–80% of native peoples were killed, captured, or fled the region. Entire towns were burned. Hundreds died in battles and raids. The Wampanoag and their allies fought desperately to preserve their independence and their lands. Plymouth Colony was at the centre of the conflict. The war started in Plymouth territory, and much of the fighting occurred in and around Plymouth settlements. The colonists who'd once depended on Wampanoag alliance now fought to exterminate them. Metacom was killed in 1676, shot by a native ally of the English. His body was beheaded and quartered. His head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 20 years. His wife and son were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The Wampanoag as an independent people were destroyed. Survivors were scattered, enslaved, or absorbed into other communities. This is the endpoint of the story that began with that first Thanksgiving in 1621. 54 years from harvest celebration to genocidal war. From shared venison and mutual dependence to severed heads on pikes and families sold into slavery. The Thanksgiving myth erases this trajectory. It freezes history at the moment of peaceful cooperation and pretends that's the whole story. It ignores that peaceful cooperation was always conditional, always based on temporary alignment of interests, always destined to collapse once those interests diverged. The Pilgrims didn't come to America planning to destroy the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag didn't welcome the Pilgrims planning to be destroyed. But the structural forces of colonialism, land hunger, demographic expansion, cultural supremacy, epidemic disease, made violent conflict almost inevitable. The treaty held for 50 years not because both sides were committed to peace, but because both sides needed each other until they didn't. William Bradford died in 1657 before King Philip's War. He never witnessed the final destruction of the alliance he'd helped create. He spent his later years writing a history of Plymouth Colony, of Plymouth Plantation, which is one of the most valuable primary sources we have for this period. It's also deeply selective, emphasizing divine providence, collective sacrifice, and moral lessons while downplaying internal conflicts, economic motivations, and cultural complexities. Bradford's history shaped how Americans remember Plymouth. He created the narrative framework that turned a failing commercial colony into a story about religious freedom and perseverance. He emphasized the starving time, the Mayflower Compact, and the treaty with Massasoit while minimizing the debt slavery, the land theft, and the economic desperation that motivated many colonists. This isn't necessarily dishonest. Bradford genuinely believed in the religious significance of Plymouth's founding, but his perspective reflects the winner's version of history, written by English colonists who survived and prospered at the expense of native peoples who didn't. Plymouth Colony never became wealthy. It never became powerful. It never achieved the grand religious vision that had motivated the original Separatists. What it became instead was functional, a small agricultural community that persisted through pragmatism rather than idealism. By the 1640s, the colony had established a rhythm. Families farmed their plots, raised livestock, and participated in the fur trade. The meeting house anchored community life. The governor and assistants administered justice and settled disputes. Children were born, married, and had children of their own. It was ordinary in a way the founding generation would have found disappointing. The Separatists had wanted to build a city on a hill, a beacon of pure religious devotion that would shame the corrupt Church of England and inspire reform. Instead, they built a town of farmers who went to church on Sundays and worried about crop yields the rest of the week. The second generation cared more about land inheritance than theological purity. The third generation barely remembered why their grandparents had come to America in the first place. This pattern of declining religious fervour became a crisis across New England in the mid-1600s. Church leaders noticed that children and grandchildren of the founding generation weren't joining churches as full members. To be a full member, you had to publicly testify to a conversion experience, a moment when you felt God's grace and knew you were among the elect. The founding generation had these experiences. They'd suffered for their faith. They'd crossed the ocean. They had dramatic spiritual testimonies. Their children, not so much. The second generation had been born in America. They attended church because it was mandatory. They believed in God in an abstract way. but they hadn't experienced persecution, hadn't made dramatic sacrifices, hadn't felt the intense spiritual passion that defined the first generation. When asked to testify to conversion, many simply couldn't. They believed the right things intellectually, but they lacked the emotional certainty their parents expected. This created a practical problem. If people couldn't join the church as full members, their children couldn't be baptized. According to Puritan theology, baptism was for children of church members. If the second generation couldn't join the church, the third generation would be unbaptized, which meant they'd be outside the church entirely. Within 2 generations, the entire religious structure would collapse. The solution, adopted in 1662, was called the Halfway Covenant. It allowed parents who'd been baptized but hadn't experienced conversion to have their children baptized. These children would be church members with limited privileges. They could have their own children baptized, but they couldn't take communion or vote on church matters. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody and disappointed everyone, but it kept the churches populated. Plymouth adopted the Halfway Covenant later than other colonies, and with significant internal debate. The original Separatists found it theologically repulsive. You were either a true believer or you weren't. Creating a category of partial membership violated their entire reason for separating from the Church of England. But pragmatism won. The alternative was watching the church slowly die as younger generations drifted away. This theological compromise reflected a broader cultural shift. The Pilgrims were becoming Americans. They were adapting to circumstances, prioritizing survival over purity, choosing pragmatism over principle. The very qualities that made them successful colonists, flexibility, practicality, willingness to compromise, undermined their identity as radical religious separatists. The economy continued to evolve through the mid-1600s. Agriculture remained the foundation: corn, vegetables, livestock. Plymouth farmers adapted English agricultural practices to New England conditions with mixed success. Wheat continued to fail in the local climate. Barley grew better, but still wasn't reliable. Corn, taught to them by the Wampanoag, became the staple crop. Peas, beans, and squash supplemented the diet. Livestock, cattle, pigs, goats, chickens, provided meat, dairy, eggs, and labour. The fur trade declined as beaver populations were hunted to near extinction. By the 1650s, traders had to travel hundreds of miles inland to find sufficient furs, competing with French traders, Dutch traders, and other English colonists. The easy profits of the 1620s and 1630s disappeared. Plymouth's economy became more diversified and more localised. Fishing became increasingly important. Plymouth wasn't as well positioned as coastal towns farther north, but colonists caught cod, bass, and shellfish for local consumption and limited export. Fishing was dangerous work, cold, wet, physically exhausting, but it provided protein and some cash income. Timber was another resource. New England's forests seemed limitless to English colonists coming from a country where most forests had been cleared centuries earlier. Plymouth colonists cut timber for building, for firewood, and for export. They built sawmills to process lumber more efficiently. The forest industry would eventually become one of New England's major economic drivers, though Plymouth remained a minor player compared to later settlements. The colony also developed craft industries. Blacksmiths produced tools, nails, and hardware. Coopers made barrels for storing and shipping goods. Carpenters built houses and furniture. Weavers produced cloth. These craftsmen operated small workshops, often training apprentices, usually their own sons or local boys whose families paid for the training. Women's economic contributions were substantial but largely invisible in official records. Women managed household economies that included gardening, food preservation, dairy production, textile work, and childcare. They produced butter, cheese, candles, soap, and cloth, all essential goods that didn't appear in trade records but were critical to family survival. Women also worked as midwives, nurses, and teachers, though these roles were informal and unpaid. The legal status of women in Plymouth was complicated. Married women had no independent legal identity. They were covered by their husbands, meaning husbands controlled all property and legal rights. Widows regained legal agency and could own property, run businesses, and sue in court. Single women over a certain age had similar rights, though they were rare since nearly everyone married. Plymouth's laws regarding women were slightly less restrictive than England's. Women could testify in court in some circumstances. Widows had protections against being completely dispossessed. The colony recognised that in a frontier settlement, where survival required everyone's labour, strict patriarchal control wasn't always practical. Women had to manage farms when husbands were away trading or fighting. They had to make decisions about planting, livestock, and household economy. Informal female authority existed even when formal legal authority didn't. Marriage in Plymouth was both a religious sacrament and an economic partnership. Couples married young by modern standards, women in their late teens or early 20s, men in their mid-20s. Marriages were typically arranged with consideration of economic compatibility, social status, and family alliances, though personal affection mattered more than in English society. On the frontier, you wanted a spouse you could work alongside for decades, not just a strategic political alliance. Divorce was rare but possible. Plymouth recognised divorce in cases of adultery, desertion, or extreme cruelty. This was more liberal than English practice, where divorce required an act of Parliament and was essentially impossible for ordinary people. The colony's pragmatism extended to marriage. If a union was genuinely destructive, ending it was preferable to maintaining legal fiction while everyone suffered. Childbearing was constant and dangerous. Women typically had 7 to 10 children, spacing births about 2 years apart. Childbirth killed about 1 in 8 mothers, making it one of the leading causes of female mortality. Infant mortality remained high. About a third of children died before age 5. Parents had large families partly from religious conviction. Children were a blessing from God. Partly from economic necessity. Children were labour, and partly from demographic reality. You needed many children to ensure some survived to adulthood. Education in Plymouth was informal and practical. There were no formal schools until late in the 1600s. Children learned by working alongside parents. Boys learned farming, craft skills and basic literacy. Girls learned housekeeping, cooking, textile work and childcare. Some families taught their children to read using the Bible and whatever other books they owned. Literacy rates were probably around 60% for men and 30% for women, which was decent for the era but not exceptional. Religious education was taken seriously. Children learned catechism, memorized Bible verses and attended services. The Puritans believed literacy was essential so people could read scripture themselves. This created pressure for basic education even when formal schooling didn't exist. Social hierarchy existed in Plymouth despite the colony's origins in religious egalitarianism. The original separatist ideal was a community of equals united in faith. The reality was a stratified society where some colonists were clearly more equal than others. At the top were the wealthy landowners and successful merchants, men like William Bradford, Miles Standish, and the undertakers who controlled the fur trade. These men had political power, economic resources and social prestige. They served as governors, magistrates, and military commanders. Their children married each other's children, creating a colonial elite that monopolized power across generations. The middle tier consisted of independent farmers and craftsmen, people who owned their land, supported their families, and participated in community decisions. They weren't wealthy, but they were free and secure. This was probably most of Plymouth's population by the 1640s and 1650s. At the bottom were servants and the poor. Indentured servants had sold years of their labour in exchange for passage to America. They had no freedom, no property, and no legal rights beyond basic protections against abuse. After their terms expired, usually 7 years, they became free but often struggled to establish themselves economically. Some succeeded and joined the middle tier. Others remained poor labourers working, for wages. The colony also had enslaved people, though slavery wasn't yet the defining institution it would become in the 1700s. Plymouth colonists enslaved Native Americans captured during conflicts, especially King Philip's War, when hundreds of native prisoners were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The colony also had a small number of enslaved Africans, brought by ships engaged in the Atlantic slave trade. The numbers were small compared to southern colonies, but slavery existed in Plymouth from early on. This is an uncomfortable fact that conflicts with the Thanksgiving mythology. The Pilgrims, who'd fled religious persecution and supposedly valued freedom, participated in enslavement. They justified it through various theological and racial arguments. Enslaved people were war captives, or heathens, or racially inferior, or all of the above. The cognitive dissonance was apparently manageable for people who believed they were God's chosen people building a new Jerusalem in the wilderness. Plymouth's legal system developed gradually and chaotically. For the first decades there was no formal legal code, just Bradford and his assistants making decisions based on English common law, biblical principles and common sense. This informality worked when the colony was small and everyone knew everyone else. It became problematic as the colony grew and disputes became more complex. The colony finally adopted a written legal code in 1636, the General Fundamentals. It codified basic criminal and civil laws, established court procedures, and defined governmental powers. The code was based on English law, but adapted to colonial circumstances. Punishments included fines, public shaming, whipping, banishment, and execution for serious crimes like murder. Capital crimes included murder, treason, witchcraft, adultery, rape, bestiality, and homosexuality. This list reflects both English legal tradition and Puritan biblical interpretation. In practice, executions were rare. Plymouth executed maybe 10 people during its entire existence as an independent colony. The death penalty existed mostly as a deterrent and a statement of moral standards. More common punishments were public shaming and corporal punishment. Offenders were placed in stocks or pillories in public view, sometimes with signs describing their crimes. This was meant to humiliate them and deter others. Whipping was the standard punishment for serious offences that didn't merit execution. Theft, assault, drunkenness, fornication, Sabbath breaking. The number of lashes varied with the crime's severity, typically ranging from 10 to 40. The colony prosecuted moral offences aggressively. Fornication, sex outside marriage, was a criminal offence. Couples who had children too soon after marriage were brought to court and fined. This might seem absurdly intrusive, but it reflected the Puritan belief that the community had a legitimate interest in maintaining moral order. Sin wasn't just a private matter between individual and God, it was a public concern that could bring God's wrath on the entire community. Drunkenness was prosecuted regularly. The colonists weren't teetotalers, they drank beer and cider daily. But excessive drinking that led to disorderly behaviour was a crime. So was selling alcohol to Native Americans, which was prohibited both for moral reasons and because colonists feared armed drunk native people. The courts also handled civil disputes, property boundaries, unpaid debts, contract violations, inheritance disputes. These cases probably outnumbered criminal prosecutions. The colony tried to resolve disputes through mediation when possible, bringing parties before magistrates who'd encourage settlement rather than formal trial. This was partly practical, trials were expensive and time-consuming, and partly ideological. Christians were supposed to resolve differences peacefully, rather than through adversarial legal combat. Governance remained simple through the 1600s. The General Court, consisting of the governor, assistants, and representatives from each town, met regularly to pass laws, levy taxes, and make major decisions. Towns sent representatives, who were always male property owners. Women, servants, and the poor had no direct representation. Elections were held annually. In theory, all free men could vote. In practice, voting rights were restricted to church members for much of the colony's history. This limited the franchise significantly, since only about 40–50% of adult males were church members. The colony wasn't a democracy. It was a religious oligarchy where church membership determined political rights. This system created tension. Many colonists who weren't church members still paid taxes, served in the militia, and contributed to the community. They resented being excluded from political decisions. The colony gradually relaxed voting restrictions, allowing non-members to participate in town meetings and vote on local issues while reserving colony-wide elections for church members. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody but prevented outright rebellion. Plymouth's military organisation was simple. Every able-bodied man was in the militia. They drilled occasionally, maintained weapons, and could be called up to respond to threats. Miles Standish organised and trained the militia until his death in 1656. After that, other men took over military leadership, though none had Standish's professional military background. The militia's primary purpose was defence against native attack, though it was also used to enforce order during civil disturbances and could be deployed to help other colonies. Plymouth's militia was never particularly large or well-trained compared to Massachusetts Bay's forces, which again reflected the colony's status as the weak link in New England's defensive network. By the 1650s and 1660s, Plymouth was stagnating. The population wasn't growing much. The economy was stable but not prosperous. The colony lacked the resources and political influence of its neighbours. Massachusetts Bay had absorbed or overshadowed most of the New England region. Connecticut was growing rapidly. Rhode Island had become the refuge for religious dissenters and freethinkers. Plymouth was just there, functional, unremarkable. The colony that had started everything was now a footnote to larger colonial ventures. William Bradford's death in 1657 symbolised the end of an era. He'd been governor for over 30 years, leading the colony through its most difficult periods. His death left a vacuum that no single individual could fill. Future governors were competent but uninspiring. The colony muddled along without clear directional purpose. The restoration of the English monarchy in 1660 created new problems. Charles II returned to the throne and immediately started reviewing colonial charters. Plymouth had never received a royal charter. They'd established their colony illegally, squatting on land without permission. For 40 years this hadn't mattered, because England was distracted by civil war and political chaos. Now it mattered. The Crown could theoretically revoke Plymouth's autonomy at any time. Plymouth sent agents to London to negotiate for a charter. They failed. Charles II granted Massachusetts Bay a new charter, but ignored Plymouth entirely. This left Plymouth in legal limbo, existing without official permission, vulnerable to being absorbed by Massachusetts, or simply dissolved if the Crown decided they were inconvenient. Then came King Philip's War. King Philip's War didn't start suddenly. It built over years through accumulated grievances, broken promises, and the slow realization on both sides that peaceful coexistence wasn't sustainable. By the 1670s, the English colonists controlled most of southern New England. Native peoples were confined to shrinking territories, subject to colonial courts, and increasingly treated as conquered subjects rather than independent allies. Metacom, King Philip, was the youngest son of Massasoit. He'd grown up watching the treaty his father made gradually become meaningless. English settlers encroached on Wampanoag lands constantly. Colonial courts prosecuted native peoples for offences while rarely punishing English crimes against Native Americans. The demographic collapse continued. Disease, alcohol, and cultural destruction were killing the Wampanoag even without open warfare. In 1671, Plymouth authorities summoned Metacom and accused him of preparing for war. They had some evidence, reports that he was stockpiling weapons and forming alliances with other native groups. Metacom denied planning war but was forced to sign a treaty acknowledging Plymouth's authority and surrendering Wampanoag weapons. This was humiliating. Massasoit had been treated as an equal sovereign. His son was being treated as a subject who could be disarmed at will. The immediate trigger for war came in 1675 when a Christian Wampanoag man named John Sassamon was murdered. Sassamon had served as Metacom's advisor, but had also acted as an informant for the English. He'd warned Plymouth authorities that Metacom was planning an uprising. Shortly after, Sassamon was found dead, his body pulled from beneath the ice of a frozen pond. Plymouth authorities arrested 3 Wampanoag men and put them on trial for murder. The trial was a farce by any reasonable standard. The jury was English. The witnesses were English or Christian Native Americans. The defendants had no meaningful representation. The proceedings assumed Metacom had ordered the murder, and the defendants had carried it out. All 3 were convicted, 2 were hanged immediately. The 3rd was shot after his hanging rope broke, an event interpreted as divine judgment. This judicial lynching infuriated Metacom and the Wampanoag. The trial violated the treaty provisions about joint jurisdiction. Plymouth had unilaterally asserted the right to try and execute Wampanoag people without consultation. The message was clear. The treaty was dead, and the English would do whatever they wanted. Within weeks, war began. It started with raids on colonial settlements near Wampanoag territory. Warriors attacked farms, burned buildings, killed livestock, and ambushed colonists. The violence was strategic, targeting isolated settlements, destroying crops, spreading terror. The goal wasn't to kill every colonist. The goal was to make English settlement untenable and force a withdrawal. Plymouth called up its militia. So did Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. The New England colonies mobilized thousands of soldiers, probably around 1,000 initially, eventually reaching 3,000 or more. This was a massive military effort for colonial societies whose entire combined population was maybe 50,000. The English expected a quick victory. They had more soldiers, better weapons, and superior organization. They assumed native forces would be easily defeated in open battle. They were catastrophically wrong. King Philip's War was a guerrilla conflict where native warriors used intimate knowledge of terrain, superior mobility, and tactical brilliance to devastate English forces. Warriors struck settlements, then vanished into forests before English militia could respond. They ambushed supply trains, they burned towns, they killed soldiers with terrifying efficiency. The English lost battle after battle. Entire militia companies were wiped out in ambushes. Settlements were abandoned as colonists fled to fortified towns. The Connecticut River Valley became a war zone. Towns like Deerfield, Northfield, and Brookfield were attacked and burned. Some were completely destroyed. Plymouth settlements suffered heavily. Swansea, Dartmouth, Taunton, Middleborough, all were attacked. Some were burned. Colonists who couldn't flee to fortified garrisons were killed or captured. Farms were destroyed, livestock slaughtered, crops burned. The economic damage was catastrophic. By the fall of 1675, the English colonies were in crisis. They'd underestimated native military capabilities, overextended their forces, and suffered shocking casualties. The war was costing enormous amounts of money. Soldiers needed to be paid, fed, and equipped. The harvest was disrupted by fighting, creating food shortages. Refugees from destroyed towns strained resources in surviving settlements. The English strategy shifted from quick victory to total war. If they couldn't defeat native forces in battle, they'd destroy the economic base supporting them. English forces began systematic destruction of native villages, food stores, and crops. They burned cornfields before harvest. They destroyed fishing weirs and clam beds. They targeted non-combatants, killing or capturing women, children, and elderly people. This was genocide. The English weren't trying to defeat an army. They were trying to eliminate a population. Colonial soldiers massacred entire villages. They sold prisoners into slavery in the Caribbean, breaking up families and communities. They executed prisoners without trial. They displayed severed heads and hands as trophies. The Great Swamp Fight in December 1675 exemplified this brutality. Colonial forces attacked a fortified Narragansett village in Rhode Island, where refugees from multiple native groups had gathered for winter. The English stormed the fort, set it on fire, and killed hundreds of people. Warriors, women, children, elderly. Estimates range from 300 to 1,000 dead. The English lost about 70 soldiers in the assault, but considered it a victory because they destroyed a major native stronghold. The survivors of the Great Swamp Fight joined Metacom's alliance, expanding the war. By early 1676, native forces were raiding deep into English territory. They attacked Lancaster, Medfield, Weymouth, towns that had seemed secure. They came within miles of Boston. The colonial governments contemplated evacuating the frontier entirely and withdrawing to coastal fortifications. But the war was destroying native peoples even faster than it was destroying English settlements. The systematic destruction of food stores created starvation. Disease spread through refugee camps. Ammunition ran low. Native forces depended on captured English weapons and powder, which became scarce as English forces tightened security. Casualties mounted without hope of replacement. Native populations had been declining for decades. They couldn't sustain prolonged warfare against a larger, wealthier enemy. By mid-1676, the war was turning. Native alliances fractured as different groups made separate peace arrangements or simply fled the region entirely. Colonial forces, reinforced and reorganized, started winning engagements. More importantly, they recruited native allies, particularly Christian Native Americans, and groups that had remained neutral or sided with the English. These native allies were crucial to English victory. They knew the terrain, tracked enemy movements, and fought with the same guerrilla tactics that had devastated English forces. They turned the war from English regulars fighting invisible enemies to native groups fighting each other with English support. Metacom spent the summer of 1676 on the run. His forces were scattered. His allies were surrendering or fleeing. He tried to rally support from native groups in New York, but was rejected. He returned to traditional Wampanoag territory, probably hoping to regroup or make a final stand. On August 12, 1676, an English force led by Benjamin Church, one of the few English officers who'd adapted to native warfare tactics, tracked Metacom to a swamp near Mount Hope in Rhode Island. Church's force included a native ally named John Alderman. They surrounded Metacom's camp and attacked at dawn. Metacom tried to flee through the swamp. Alderman shot him. The body was retrieved, beheaded and quartered. The head was taken to Plymouth and mounted on a pike on the fort, where it remained for 20 years. One of Metacom's hands was given to Alderman as a trophy. The other was preserved and displayed publicly. Metacom's wife and 9-year-old son were captured and sold into slavery in the Caribbean. This wasn't justice. This was triumph through mutilation and enslavement. The English celebrated Metacom's death as divine victory. God had delivered their enemies into their hands. They didn't reflect on what they'd destroyed or consider whether the war had been necessary or just. King Philip's War was the deadliest conflict in American history relative to population. About 3,000 native people died in battle or from war-related disease and starvation. About 2,000 more were sold into slavery or fled the region. The native population of southern New England, already devastated by epidemics, was effectively eliminated as an independent force. A few thousand survivors remained, mostly Christian converts living in praying towns under English supervision. English casualties were also severe. About 600 colonists died, roughly 5% of the total New England population. 12 towns were completely destroyed. Dozens more were damaged. The economic cost was astronomical, probably equivalent to the entire colonial economy for a year. Many families were bankrupted. The colonies went deeply into debt. Plymouth Colony bore a disproportionate burden. The war started in Plymouth territory. Plymouth settlements suffered the worst attacks. Plymouth's small population and limited resources made recovery difficult. The colony never fully recovered economically or demographically from King Philip's War. The war also ended any lingering pretense of respect for native sovereignty. Before 1675, colonial authorities at least formally acknowledged native peoples as independent nations with whom they had treaty relationships. After 1676, native peoples in southern New England were treated as conquered subjects. Their land was confiscated. Their movements were restricted. They were forced into reservations or absorbed into colonial society as labourers and servants. The mythology around Thanksgiving became impossible to sustain in the face of this history. How do you celebrate Pilgrims and Indians sharing a harvest feast when the story ends with genocide? The answer, apparently, is to simply stop the story at 1621 and pretend nothing happened afterward. Freeze history at the moment of peaceful cooperation and ignore the 54 years of deteriorating relations that ended in catastrophic violence. But even before the war, Plymouth Colony was declining. By 1675, the colony was barely relevant to New England's economic and political life. Massachusetts Bay dominated. Connecticut was more dynamic. Even Rhode Island, founded by religious dissidents expelled from Massachusetts, was more influential than Plymouth in regional affairs. Plymouth's population in 1675 was maybe 6,000 people. Decent growth from the original 100, but tiny compared to Massachusetts Bay's 30,000. The colony's economy remained agricultural and small-scale. There were no major ports, no significant industries, no reason for merchants or entrepreneurs to choose Plymouth over Boston or other more prosperous towns. The war accelerated the decline. Destroyed towns struggled to rebuild. People left for safer or more prosperous colonies. Immigration to Plymouth was negligible. Why would new colonists choose a poor, war-damaged colony when they could settle in Massachusetts or Connecticut? Plymouth's legal independence became increasingly questionable after 1660. The restoration of the monarchy brought renewed attention to colonial governance. King Charles II and his successors wanted to consolidate control over the colonies, which meant reviewing charters and potentially reorganising colonial governments. Plymouth had no charter. They'd been squatting illegally for 60 years. Their only claim to legitimacy was continuous occupation and the fact that nobody had bothered to evict them. This became a serious problem in the 1680s when the Crown started consolidating New England colonies under royal governance. In 1686, King James II created the Dominion of New England, combining Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and later New York and New Jersey into a single administrative unit under royal control. The Dominion dissolved in 1689 after James II was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, but the experience revealed Plymouth's vulnerability. When new colonial charters were issued in the 1690s, Plymouth wasn't granted one. Instead, in 1691, Plymouth Colony was officially absorbed into Massachusetts Bay. After 70 years of independent existence, Plymouth simply ceased to exist as a separate political entity. The towns became part of Massachusetts. The government was dissolved. The separate identity ended. This absorption was anticlimactic. There was no dramatic conquest, no rebellion, no last stand for independence. Plymouth just merged. Most colonists didn't care much. They were already economically and culturally integrated with Massachusetts. Formal political union just recognised reality. The absorption erased Plymouth from the map, which is ironic given its later mythological significance. The Pilgrims, who would become foundational figures in American mythology, were such failures that their colony disappeared into a neighbour's administrative structure. If Plymouth's historical importance was measured by its actual achievements, it would be a footnote. A small, poor colony that struggled for 70 years and then got absorbed by a larger neighbour. But history isn't determined by what actually mattered at the time. It's determined by what later generations choose to remember, and why they choose to remember it. Plymouth became important not because of what the Pilgrims accomplished, but because their story could be retold to serve later ideological needs. The Pilgrims became symbols of religious freedom, ignoring that they fled England because they weren't allowed to impose their religious views on everyone else, and spent their time in America creating a theocracy. They became symbols of democratic self-governance, ignoring that the Mayflower Compact was a desperate attempt to prevent mutiny, and Plymouth remained an oligarchy where church members controlled political power. They became symbols of peaceful cooperation with Native Americans, ignoring the theft, the conflicts, and the fact that the story ends in King Philip's War. They became symbols of American values, hard work, perseverance, faith, ignoring the economic failure, the debt slavery, and the fact that half of them died because they were unprepared for the environment they'd invaded. The Thanksgiving myth crystallized in the 19th century when Americans were building a national identity and needed origin stories. The Pilgrims were perfect. They weren't aristocrats like Virginia colonists. They weren't Catholics like the Spanish. They weren't motivated by pure greed. They came for religious freedom, worked hard, cooperated with natives, and established the foundations of American democracy. Except none of that is quite true. It's not entirely false either. The Pilgrims did value religious freedom for themselves, did work hard when starvation was the alternative, did cooperate with natives when they were too weak to do otherwise, and did establish self-governance because nobody else was governing them. but the myth simplifies, sanitizes, and reframes everything to create a usable past rather than an accurate one. The first Thanksgiving became a national holiday in 1863 during the Civil War because Abraham Lincoln wanted to create unity around shared American values. He chose the Pilgrims' harvest celebration as a symbol of peace, gratitude, and national identity. The irony of declaring a national day of thanks during a catastrophic civil war apparently escaped notice, or maybe that was the point, to assert that America had shared values worth celebrating even when Americans were killing each other. The modern Thanksgiving celebration has almost nothing to do with the 1621 Harvest Festival. We eat turkey because that became standardised in the 19th century, not because the Pilgrims did. We eat cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie, foods the Pilgrims either didn't have or didn't prepare that way. We gather with family for a large meal, which is traditional across many cultures and wasn't unique to Plymouth. The mythology around Thanksgiving is comforting. It tells us that America was founded by people who overcame hardship through faith and cooperation. It suggests that peaceful coexistence between different peoples is part of our national DNA. It frames our national origin as a harvest celebration rather than a commercial venture, a military conquest, or an epidemic that killed 90% of the indigenous population. The reality is more complicated and less comforting. The Pilgrims were human. This seems obvious, but it's worth stating explicitly because the mythology has transformed them into something else, either saintly founders of American virtue or villainous colonizers responsible for genocide, depending on who's telling the story. Both versions strip them of humanity and reduce them to symbols. The actual people who sailed on the Mayflower were neither saints nor monsters. They were desperate, flawed, complicated people making terrible decisions under impossible circumstances, while convinced they were doing God's will. They were capable of extraordinary courage and petty cruelty, genuine religious devotion and shameless self-interest, compassion for their own and indifference to outsiders. William Bradford genuinely believed he was building a godly community. He also personally profited from the fur trade and owned the land of people who died in epidemics. Both things are true. Miles Standish was a professional soldier who defended the colony. He was also responsible for preemptive massacres of native leaders. Both things are true. The colonists who nursed each other through the starving time demonstrated real altruism. They also stole corn from native storage pits and later sold native children into slavery. All of it is true. History isn't a morality play where we sort people into heroes and villains. It's a record of human beings navigating complex situations with incomplete information, cultural prejudices, and survival instincts. The Pilgrims weren't uniquely evil. Most European colonial ventures were far more brutal than Plymouth. But they weren't uniquely virtuous either. They participated in colonialism, which is fundamentally about taking resources and land from other peoples through violence or coercion. What we can learn from Plymouth's history isn't a simple moral lesson. It's not, the Pilgrims were good and we should emulate them, or the Pilgrims were bad and we should condemn them. It's more complicated than that. First lesson, survival doesn't make you right. The Pilgrims survived against incredible odds. Half of them died in the first year, and the survivors endured unimaginable hardship. This is genuinely impressive. But surviving doesn't validate their actions or prove they were morally superior. Lots of people survive through theft, exploitation and violence. The Pilgrims were no different. They did what they needed to survive, and some of what they needed to do was ethically questionable at best. Second lesson, good intentions don't erase bad outcomes. The Pilgrims genuinely believed they were creating a pure religious community. They thought they were doing God's work. They probably didn't intend to participate in the near extermination of native peoples. But intention isn't the same as impact. The epidemics that killed the Wampanoag weren't the Pilgrims' fault, but the land theft, legal subordination, and eventual genocidal warfare were direct results of English colonization. You don't get moral credit for not intending the predictable consequences of your actions. Third lesson, alliances based on temporary interests are fragile. The treaty between Plymouth and the Wampanoag lasted 50 years because both sides needed each other. When that need ended, When English colonists became numerous and powerful enough to take what they wanted without negotiation, the alliance collapsed into war. This is a recurring pattern in history. Peaceful coexistence is possible when both sides benefit from peace. When one side becomes powerful enough to benefit from war, peace ends. This isn't cynicism, it's realism. Fourth lesson. Cultural assimilation and demographic collapse are forms of violence even when nobody's holding a gun. The Wampanoag weren't destroyed only by King Philip's War. They were destroyed by epidemics, by economic disruption, by forced cultural assimilation, by land loss, by alcoholism, by absorption into colonial society as subordinate labourers. The violence was systemic and spread across decades. The war was just the final chapter. By the time Metacom raised his forces, the Wampanoag were already a dying people fighting for survival against demographic and cultural annihilation. Fifth lesson. Mythology simplifies the past to serve the present. The Thanksgiving story we tell is designed to make us feel good about ourselves. It emphasizes cooperation, gratitude, and shared values. It frames America's origin as a harvest celebration rather than a real estate speculation gone horribly right. This isn't necessarily malicious. Every nation creates founding myths that emphasize its virtues and minimize its sins. But we should be honest about what we're doing when we tell these stories. We're not preserving history, we're constructing identity. The Pilgrims themselves would probably be horrified by modern Thanksgiving celebrations. They'd see a secular holiday focused on food and family rather than religious devotion. They'd see people eating massive meals without fasting first or expressing genuine spiritual gratitude. They'd see Native Americans invited to participate in celebrations of a history that led to their near destruction. They'd find the whole thing sacrilegious and historically wrong, and they'd be right. Modern Thanksgiving isn't about the Pilgrims, it's about us. Our need for national origin stories, our desire to believe America was founded on good principles, our preference for simple narratives over complicated truths. The Pilgrims are just convenient symbols we've repurposed for our own needs. This doesn't mean Thanksgiving is bad or that we should cancel it. Gathering with family, sharing food, and expressing gratitude are good things. The holiday serves important social functions. But we should be honest about what we're celebrating and what we're ignoring. We're not commemorating actual historical events. We're performing a national ritual that uses a heavily edited version of history as its script. If we wanted to be historically accurate, Thanksgiving would include acknowledgement that the peaceful cooperation lasted 50 years and ended in genocidal war. It would include recognition that the Pilgrims' survival depended on occupying land cleared by epidemic and stealing food from native storage sites. It would include discussion of how early American prosperity was built on land taken from indigenous peoples who were killed, displaced, or forced into subordination. But we don't do that. We tell the 1621 harvest story and stop there, freezing history at the moment of maximum cooperation and ignoring everything that came after. This is understandable. Nobody wants to contemplate genocide and colonialism while eating turkey with their family. But the refusal to engage with uncomfortable history doesn't make that history disappear. It just means we're not learning from it. The Wampanoag still exist, incidentally. This surprises many Americans who assume they were completely exterminated. There are several thousand Wampanoag people today, primarily in Massachusetts. They maintain their cultural identity, language, and traditions. They've survived centuries of colonization, cultural suppression, and systematic attempts to erase their existence. That survival is remarkable and worth acknowledging. Many Wampanoag people have complicated feelings about Thanksgiving. Some participate in the holiday. Others observe a national day of mourning, gathering at Plymouth Rock to commemorate the genocide of native peoples and the theft of their lands. Both responses are valid. There's no single correct way for indigenous peoples to respond to a national holiday that celebrates a mythologized version of their ancestors' interactions with colonizers. Plymouth Rock itself is a tourist attraction now, sitting under a protective portico on the waterfront. It's a small rock. The Pilgrims probably didn't actually step on it when they first landed. That story emerged more than a century later and is likely mythological. But the rock has become a symbol anyway, marking the spot where American history supposedly began. Except American history didn't begin in 1620. It began thousands of years earlier when the first peoples arrived in North America. Or it began when Europeans started exploring and claiming the territory in the 1500s. Or it began when English colonization created permanent settlements in the early 1600s. Or it began when the colonies united against Britain in 1776. Or it began when the Constitution was ratified in 1788. There is no single origin point. History is continuous, and choosing a starting point is always arbitrary and political. We choose 1620 and the Pilgrims because that story serves particular ideological needs. It emphasizes religious freedom, democratic self-governance, hard work, and peaceful cooperation. It presents America as founded by ordinary people seeking a better life rather than by conquistadors seeking gold, plantation owners seeking profit, or generals seeking territory. The Pilgrims make us feel good about our origins in ways that Virginia tobacco planters, Caribbean sugar barons, or Spanish conquistadors don't. But feeling good about history isn't the same as understanding it. The Pilgrim story is worth knowing, not because it teaches simple moral lessons, but because it's complicated, messy, and human in ways that resist easy categorization. It shows how religious idealism crashes into practical necessity, how survival requires compromise, how temporary alliances form and dissolve, how cultural contact leads to both cooperation and conflict, and how the same people can be simultaneously victims and perpetrators depending on perspective. William Bradford spent his final years writing a history of Plymouth Colony, trying to make sense of what they'd built and whether it had been worth the cost. He'd fled England as a young man to preserve his faith. He'd spent decades in Leiden working brutal jobs to maintain his community. He'd crossed the Atlantic, lost his wife, buried half his fellow colonists, and governed Plymouth for 30 years. He'd negotiated treaties, made compromises, authorized violence, and watched the religious purity he'd sought gradually erode. In his history, Bradford expressed disappointment that the younger generation lacked the spiritual fervour of the founders. He worried that Plymouth had become worldly and materialistic. He questioned whether they'd achieved anything lasting. These aren't the reflections of a triumphant founder. They're the doubts of an old man wondering if his life's work had mattered. Bradford died in 1657 at age 67. He left behind a colony that worked, sort of, but hadn't fulfilled its religious mission. Plymouth survived, but it didn't thrive. It maintained its existence, but it didn't inspire other settlements to emulate its model. Bradford's generation had sacrificed everything to build a pure church in the wilderness. The next generation took that sacrifice for granted and pursued ordinary lives, farming, trading, marrying, raising children. Within 2 generations, the religious passion that had motivated the entire venture had mostly dissipated, replaced by generic Protestantism and pragmatic self-interest. Was it worth it? That depends on who you ask and what you value. For the Pilgrims who survived and prospered, probably yes. They built farms, raised families, and lived free from religious persecution. For the Pilgrims who died in the starving time, probably not. They suffered horribly and never saw the settlement succeed. For the Wampanoag, absolutely not. Their alliance with Plymouth contributed to long-term demographic collapse and eventual genocidal war. For later Americans who used the Pilgrims as founding symbols, yes, the mythology served important nation-building purposes regardless of historical accuracy. History doesn't have simple answers. It just has stories about people making choices under pressure and living with the consequences. The Pilgrims made choices to flee England, to settle in New England, to ally with the Wampanoag, to steal corn, to establish self-governance, to enforce religious conformity, to participate in the fur trade, to authorize preemptive violence. Those choices created consequences that rippled forward through generations, eventually producing the world we inhabit. We're still living with those consequences. The relationship between European-descended Americans and indigenous peoples is still defined by the patterns established in the 1600s: land dispossession, cultural suppression, demographic displacement, uneasy coexistence. The tension between religious idealism and secular pragmatism that the Pilgrims experienced still shapes American politics. the question of who belongs in America and what rights they have still echoes the debates about church membership and political participation in Plymouth Colony. The Pilgrims don't have answers for us. They were just people trying to survive in circumstances they barely understood. But their struggles mirror our own in uncomfortable ways. The difficulty of maintaining idealism in the face of practical constraints, the temptation to justify exploitation through religious or ideological narratives, the ease with which defensive alliances can transform into aggressive expansion, the tendency to mythologize the past rather than learn from it. So when you sit down for Thanksgiving dinner this year, or any year, and someone mentions the Pilgrims and Indians sharing a meal, you'll know the rest of the story. You'll know about the Mayflower's delays, the starving time, the stolen corn, the treaty born of mutual weakness, the 50 years of uneasy coexistence, and the genocidal war that ended it. You'll know that the harvest celebration in 1621 was real, but not particularly significant at the time, that it was retroactively identified as the first Thanksgiving centuries later for political purposes, and that the mythology bears little resemblance to the complicated, morally ambiguous reality. You'll know that the Pilgrims were human, neither heroes nor villains, but flawed people making decisions they believed were right while often being catastrophically wrong about the consequences. You'll know that their story doesn't teach simple lessons about American virtue, but rather complicated truths about colonialism, survival, religious idealism, cultural conflict, and the gap between intention and impact. And maybe, if you're feeling generous, you'll appreciate that they tried. They failed in most of what they set out to do. Plymouth never became a pure religious community, never prospered economically, never inspired widespread imitation, and was eventually absorbed by the neighbour it had preceded. But they tried. They crossed an ocean in a leaking ship, survived a winter that killed half their number, built houses in the wilderness, planted crops in unfamiliar soil, negotiated with people whose language they didn't speak, and maintained a settlement against enormous odds. That's something. Not everything. Not enough to justify the mythology or excuse the harm, but something. A small, flawed human achievement in an enormous, complicated, often tragic history. And that, ultimately, is what the Pilgrims offer us. Not a template for American virtue, but a reminder that history is made by ordinary people doing their best in impossible situations and usually getting things partly wrong. They weren't special. They weren't chosen. They weren't building a perfect society or inaugurating a new age of human freedom. They were just English religious radicals who got in over their heads and somehow didn't drown. They began with a lump of iron, metaphorically speaking, unglamorous, unremarkable, and yet somehow the material from which they built their world. The iron wasn't noble, the world they built wasn't perfect, but both the iron and the world they forged from it were real, and that reality, complicated, uncomfortable, and human, is worth understanding in all its messy, contradictory detail. So give thanks for whatever you're grateful for. Eat your historically inaccurate turkey and cranberry sauce. Spend time with family. Enjoy the day off. But remember that the story we tell about the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving is mythology, not history, and that the real history, while less comforting, is far more interesting and instructive than the myth could ever be. The Pilgrims would probably find that ironic. They spent their lives trying to build something eternal and righteous. Instead, they became symbols in a secular celebration of a narrative they wouldn't recognize. Their religious mission failed. Their colony was absorbed. Their ideals were forgotten. But their mythology endured, transformed beyond recognition, serving purposes they'd find horrifying. History has that effect. It takes what we build and repurposes it for needs we never imagined. The Pilgrims built Plymouth, America built Thanksgiving, and we're left trying to figure out which story actually matters and why.